April 1868. The war had been over for 3 years, but Jackson Reed still slept with his Henry, repeating rifle within arm's reach. Old habits, they said, died hard. Combat instincts died even harder. Reed's eyes snapped open at the sound. Not gunfire or cannon, he'd grown accustomed to those in dreams, but the soft percussion of hoofbeats moving in formation. Disciplined, military, or something trying to be. He rolled from his bed in one fluid motion, grabbing the Henry with his right hand. His left arm ended just below the elbow, a permanent souvenir from Appomattox Courthouse, where the last meaningful resistance of the Confederate Army had dissolved into bloody surrender. Through the window of his small cabin, Reed saw them bobbing lanterns moving like fireflies through the darkness. A dozen, maybe more, following the creek bed that marked the eastern boundary of his property. Even in the darkness, he recognized the distinctive white hoods. "The White Association," he muttered. "Just what this night needed." Reed had purposely chosen this remote stretch of Blue Ridge foothills to disappear into after the war. Too rocky for proper farming, too far from town for social calls. Perfect for a man intent on drinking himself into oblivion without an audience. Perfect until tonight. He pulled on his boots and a worn cavalry jacket that still bore the faded insignia of a Confederate lieutenant. The left sleeve was pinned up neatly, a habit of military precision he couldn't shake, even as he'd abandoned most others. The riders had dismounted near the abandoned McGrath property that bordered his land. Reed watched from his porch as they formed a ragged circle, lanterns illuminating the grotesque shadow play of their hooded figures against the trees. Their voices carried on the night air, angry, excited, the sound of men emboldened by darkness and numbers. Then he heard it. A child's scream, high and terrified. Reed's scarred face hardened. The war had taught him to ignore many things: pain, hunger, the faces of the dead. But he'd never learned to ignore that sound. It had haunted him since that night outside Richmond when his unit had... No, he wouldn't think about that now. Through the rifle's scope, he could make out the scene more clearly. 3 figures stood encircled by the hooded men, 2 women and a boy. One woman stood tall, defiant, despite the bruise darkening her jaw. The other cradled the child who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Even from this distance, Reed could see the boy was colored. The women, one colored, one white, stood protectively before him. Carpetbagger schoolteacher, Reed realized. The rumors in town had mentioned something about a northern woman setting up a school that dared to teach colored children alongside whites. Reed had ignored the gossip as he ignored most things that didn't involve whiskey or ammunition. A gunshot cracked through the night. Not aimed to kill, fired into the air as a threat. The child cried out again. Reed lowered his rifle, fighting the instinct that pulled him forward. This wasn't his fight. He'd sworn after Appomattox that he'd never raise his weapon for or against another man's cause. He'd done his fighting. 3 years of blood and horror had earned him the right to silence, to isolation, to forgetting. Reverend Mitchell's words came back to him unbidden. The old preacher who'd found Reed half dead after the surrender, who'd nursed him back to health despite knowing he wore gray. "Hell is reserved for those who watch and do nothing, Lieutenant Reed," Mitchell had said. "And I suspect you've already seen enough of hell to last several lifetimes." Another shot split the night. Reed saw one of the hooded men grab the white woman by her hair, forcing her to her knees. "Damn it all," Reed whispered, checking his rifle's chamber. 6 rounds loaded, 20 more in his pocket. Enough for a statement, if not a war. He stepped off the porch, the weight of his decision settling on him like an iron yoke. "Hell is for those who watch and do nothing," he repeated to himself. as he vanished into the darkness. The woods were Reed's ally. 3 years of hunting these hills had taught him every hollow and ridge. He moved like a shadow, keeping to the tree line as he circled around behind the gathered clansmen. Their attention was fixed on the 3 captives, making his approach almost too easy. Teaching them ideas above their station, a voice rose above the others. Reed recognized it immediately. Curtis Hamilton, the banker who owned half the businesses in Elkhorn Valley. Self-proclaimed gentleman, church deacon, and apparently the leader of tonight's activities. The school was authorized by the Freedmen's Bureau, the white woman replied, her Boston accent distinct even through split lips. These children have every right to an education. Rights, Hamilton laughed. You northern folk are mighty concerned with rights these days. What about our rights? The right to determine who teaches what to whom in our county. Reed edged closer, catching his first clear look at the captives. The white woman was younger than he'd expected, perhaps late 20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun that had partially collapsed in the struggle. Despite her bloody lip and torn dress, she stood with the rigid determination of someone who believed absolutely in her cause. The colored woman was older, her face etched with the quiet dignity that comes from surviving a lifetime of hardship. She held the boy close, whispering something in his ear that seemed to calm his trembling. I've had enough of this discussion, Hamilton announced, gesturing to his men. Bring the boy forward. 2 hooded figures moved to grab the child. The colored woman fought them, her strength surprising the men, until one of them struck her hard across the face with the back of his hand. She crumpled to the ground. Mama! The boy cried out, struggling against his captors. Now, Solomon, Hamilton said, his voice taking on a performative gentleness that made Reed's skin crawl. We're going to teach you and your kind an important lesson tonight about the natural order of things. Reed had seen enough. He stepped from the shadows, his rifle raised to his shoulder. The familiarity of the stance, the weight of the weapon, the pressure against his cheek, sent him hurtling back to battlefields strewn with the dead and dying. For a moment, the hooded figures before him transformed into Union soldiers, their bayonets glinting in the morning sun. He blinked the vision away. Focus. Now. That's enough, Hamilton, Reed called out, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded men through the hell of Gettysburg. The hooded figures whirled, several reaching for weapons. Reed fired a single shot into the air. Next one won't be a warning, he said, cycling the lever action smoothly, despite his missing hand. A skill perfected through countless hours of practice. Hamilton pushed his hood back, his florid face contorted with surprise and anger. Jackson Reed, I heard you were holed up in these hills, but I didn't believe you'd sunk low enough to defend nigger lovers. Reed ignored the bait, his eyes scanning the group. One man stood slightly apart from the others, his posture military straight, despite the ridiculous hood. Something in the way he held himself. Take off your hood, soldier, Reed commanded, addressing the man directly. There was a moment of hesitation before the man complied, revealing the weathered face of James Sheridan. Reed recognized him instantly, not from town, but from across a battlefield. Sheridan had fought for the Union at Antietam. Reed had seen him rallying his men even as Confederate artillery tore through their ranks. Sheridan, Reed acknowledged with a slight nod, didn't take you for the type to hide behind a hood. Sheridan's jaw tightened. Times change, Reed. Some things don't, Reed countered. Soldier's code. No man harms a woman or child, not in war, not in peace. A flicker of something, shame perhaps, crossed Sheridan's face before he hardened it again. Hamilton stepped forward. This is none of your concern, Reed. These people are breaking the law, corrupting the natural order. The boy needs to be taught, The only lesson being taught tonight, Reed interrupted, is that you're leaving. All of you. Now. Hamilton laughed, gesturing to his men. There are 15 of us, Reed, and only one of you. A one-armed traitor at that. One arm's all I need, Reed replied calmly. First man who moves toward these people gets a bullet. Second man, too. I won't have time for a third, but by then, the odds will be better. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Reed kept his rifle trained on Hamilton, but his awareness expanded to encompass the entire scene. The subtle shifting of men, calculating their chances, the slow retreat of the captives toward the trees, the owl that had gone silent overhead, sensing danger. You're dying tonight either way, Reed, Hamilton finally said, his voice low and vicious. If not by bullet, then by ruin. I own this valley. You've just made yourself an enemy of every God-fearing white man in the county. Reed didn't blink. Not the first time, won't be the last. A strange smile crossed Hamilton's face. You don't even know what you're protecting, do you? What's really at stake? He turned to his men. We're leaving, for now. As the hooded figures retreated to their horses, Hamilton lingered, his eyes fixed on Reed, with cold calculation. You died to us the moment you pointed that rifle, Reed, he said quietly. We'll make sure you get a proper funeral. Reed maintained his position until the last rider disappeared into the darkness. Only then did he lower his rifle, the tension in his body uncoiling slightly as he turned to the three figures huddled at the edge of the clearing. The white woman stood protectively in front of the others, her chin raised in defiance, or perhaps uncertainty about whether she'd just exchanged one danger for another. You're hurt, Reed said, gesturing to her bleeding lip. All of you need tending. My cabin's half a mile north. You'll be safer there tonight. Why would a Confederate soldier help us? The woman asked, her voice steady, despite her obvious exhaustion. Reed looked at her for a long moment. War's been over 3 years, ma'am. I'm just a man with a rifle now. He glanced back toward where the riders had disappeared. And they'll be back before dawn, with more men. The colored woman finally spoke, her voice soft but determined. We don't have anywhere else to go, Miss Hannah. They burned the schoolhouse. Hannah, the white woman, seemed to weigh her options before nodding reluctantly. Very well, Mr. Reed, Jackson Reed. Thank you, Mr. Reed. I'm Hannah Turner. This is Sarah and her son, Solomon. Reed nodded, not meeting their eyes. Stay close. The path is rough. As they made their way through the darkness toward his cabin, Reed felt the familiar weight of command settling back onto his shoulders, a burden he'd thought he'd left buried at Appomattox. The war, it seemed, wasn't finished with him after all. Reed's cabin wasn't built for company. One room spartanly furnished with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with books that surprised Hannah Turner when she noticed them. The spines spoke of law history and military strategy, not the reading material she'd expected from a backwoods recluse. You're a lawyer, she asked, as Reed built up the fire. Was, he replied without elaboration, setting a kettle to boil. Reed worked methodically to treat their injuries, his movements precise, despite his missing hand. He cleaned Hannah's split lip with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his hardened exterior. When he turned his attention to Sarah, he found her eyeing him warily. I'm not going to hurt you, he said quietly. Wouldn't be the first white man to say that before doing exactly that, she responded, but allowed him to clean the cut on her cheekbone. Solomon's injuries were mostly bruises and scrapes from being roughly handled. The boy watched Reed with undisguised fascination, particularly his pinned sleeve. Did it hurt? The boy finally asked. When you lost your arm. Solomon, Sarah scolded. Mind your manners. Reed surprised himself by answering. Not at first. Too much happening. Later, yes. The boy nodded solemnly. My pa lost his leg at Vicksburg. He said sometimes he can still feel it, even though it ain't there. Solomon's father died last winter, Sarah explained softly. Fever. Reed nodded, recognizing the familiar story of so many veterans North and South alike, who had survived the war only to be claimed by disease, drink, or despair in the uncertain peace that followed. You fought for the South, Hannah stated, rather than asked, her eyes fixed on his old jacket hanging by the door. I did. Why help us then? Most ex-Confederates around here seem to support men like Hamilton and his white association. Reed poured coffee, real coffee, not chicory, into tin cups. I'm not most men. That doesn't answer my question. Reed considered the woman across from him. Her directness was jarring after years of near solitude, but there was something refreshing about it too. I've seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, Miss Turner. Some lines shouldn't be crossed, no matter what flag you served under. Hannah seemed to accept this, at least for now. They'll come for us again, for you too now. I know. The school was legal, she insisted. I have papers from the Freedmen's Bureau authorizing— Papers don't mean much out here, Reed interrupted. Not when men like Hamilton decide they don't. The law is whatever the man with the most guns or the most money says it is. Reed cut her off again. That's how it's always been in places like this. Before the war, during, and now after. Hannah's eyes flashed. Then, what's the point of anything, of trying to build something better? These children deserve education opportunity. I'm not saying they don't, Reed replied, his voice softening slightly. I'm saying, understand what you're up against. Sarah, who had been quiet during this exchange, finally spoke. What Mr. Reed means, Miss Hannah, is that your northern papers work differently down here. Men like Hamilton don't fear papers. They fear losing power. Reed gave Sarah an appraising look. She understood the reality of their situation better than the idealistic northerner. Why does Hamilton care so much about one small school? Reed asked. Seems like a lot of effort for something that doesn't affect him directly. Hannah and Sarah exchanged glances. The school sits on land that belonged to a free black community before the war, Hannah explained. When the war started, they were driven off or killed. The Freedmen's Bureau reclaimed it as abandoned property. But that's not the real reason, Sarah added. There's coal in those hills, and the new railroad is planned to come through Elkhorn Valley. Reed understood immediately. Land that's worth nothing today will be worth a fortune in 5 years. Hamilton's been buying up everything he can, Hannah confirmed. Our school and the settlement around it are the only properties in the valley he doesn't control. The pieces clicked into place for Reed. This wasn't just about racial hatred or resentment toward northern interlopers. It was about money, land, power, the eternal motivations that had driven men long before the war and would continue long after everyone who fought in it was dust. Get some rest, Reed said, rising from the table. You can take the bed. I'll keep watch. Hannah started to protest, but exhaustion won out. Soon, Sarah and Solomon were asleep on Reed's narrow bed while Hannah dozed fitfully in a chair by the fire. Reed sat by the window rifle across his lap and watched the darkness. Old habits. His thoughts drifted to the men of Company 7, his unit during the war. Most were dead now, fallen at Gettysburg, or the Wilderness, or a dozen other blood-soaked fields. He'd sworn to them, to himself, that he'd never again raise his weapon in anger after the surrender. Yet here he was, once more standing between the innocent and those who would harm them. The irony wasn't lost on him. Dawn was breaking when a rider appeared on the ridge above his cabin. Not one of Hamilton's hooded men, but a boy from town, Tommy Fletcher, the blacksmith's son. He approached cautiously, clearly nervous about his errand. "Mr. Reed," Tommy called from a safe distance, "Mr. Hamilton sent me with this." The boy extended an envelope, then quickly retreated to his horse after Reed took it. Inside was a legal document, official-looking with multiple seals and signatures. Reed read it carefully, his expression darkening with each paragraph. Hannah had awakened and moved to stand beside him. "What is it?" "Notice of eviction." Reed said, his voice flat. "Apparently, the man who sold me this land 3 years ago didn't actually own it. According to this, the property belongs to Hamilton's bank due to an unpaid mortgage from before the war." "That can't be legal," Hannah protested. "Like I said, the law is whatever the man with the most money says it is." Reed folded the paper carefully. "We have 3 days to vacate." "We'll fight this," Hannah insisted. "I have contacts at the Bureau. They can do nothing in 3 days," Reed interrupted. "Hamilton controls the local courts. By the time your northern friends navigate the proper channels, we'll be long gone, or dead. So we just give up, run away." Hannah's voice rose with indignation. "No," Reed said, reaching for his jacket. "We go to town." "Town?" "After what happened last night, that's suicide." Reed checked his rifle methodically, his movements practiced and efficient, despite his disability. "Sometimes you have to show your face to your enemy. Let them see. You're not afraid." "Are you?" Hannah asked. "Afraid?" Reed paused, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. "I've been dead since Appomattox, Miss Turner. Hard to fear much after that." He turned to Sarah, who had awakened during their conversation. "Stay here with Solomon. Bar the door behind us. If anyone but us comes back, there's a shotgun under the bed." Sarah nodded her eyes, communicating a lifetime of understanding about violence and its necessities. "God go with you," she said softly. As Reed and Hannah mounted his 2 horses, he felt a familiar sensation settling into his bones, the cold clarity that came before battle. He'd never expected to feel it again, certainly not for a cause that wasn't his own. Yet, as they rode toward Elkhorn Valley, Reed realized that perhaps he'd found something he'd lost at Appomattox, along with his arm and his faith in humanity, a purpose. The town was just waking as they arrived, shopkeepers opening their doors, women hanging laundry, the blacksmith's hammer already ringing against his anvil. All activity ceased as Reed and Hannah rode down the main street. Windows closed. People retreated indoors. The silence was complete, except for the horses' hooves on packed dirt. They dismounted outside the bank. Hamilton's bank. Reed tied the horses, then turned to Hannah. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "No matter what happens." As they approached the bank's entrance, 4 men stepped out from the alleyway beside the building. Reed recognized them as Hamilton's men from the previous night, though they wore no hoods now. They carried no visible weapons, but their intentions were clear in the way they positioned themselves to block Reed's path. "Mr. Hamilton ain't receiving visitors today," said the largest of the men, a butcher named Daniels, whose forearms were thick as hams. "I'm not here to visit," Reed replied evenly. "I'm here about a legal matter." "Legal matters go through the sheriff," another man said. "And Sheriff Wilson ain't friendly to nigger lovers and traitors." Reed noticed the growing crowd at the edges of the street, townsfolk pretending not to watch while missing nothing. This was what Hamilton wanted, a public humiliation, or better yet, a provocation that would give his men justification for violence. "Step aside," Reed said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded men through artillery barrages. Daniels laughed, looking to his companions. "You hear that, boys? The one-armed traitor is giving orders." The first punch came from Reed's blind side, a mistake on their part. Combat instincts took over as he pivoted, using his attacker's momentum to slam him face first into the bank's brick wall. The second man rushed him, receiving Reed's boot to his knee with a sickening crack. Daniels and the fourth man came together confident in their advantage. Reed had fought worse odds with worse injuries. He blocked a wild swing with his forearm, driving his elbow into one man's throat before turning to face Daniels. The butcher pulled a knife, a short, wicked blade designed for breaking down carcasses. "Time to finish what the Yankees started," he growled, lunging forward. Reed sidestepped, catching Daniels' wrist and twisting sharply. The knife clattered to the ground as the larger man howled in pain. A quick strike to the temple with Reed's elbow dropped him like a stone. The entire fight had lasted less than 30 seconds. 4 men lay groaning or unconscious at Reed's feet. He stood unscathed, his breathing barely elevated. Hannah stared at him in shock. The gathered townsfolk murmured, their expressions ranging from fear to reluctant admiration. Reed calmly retrieved his hat, which had fallen during the scuffle, and placed it back on his head. "Now," he said to no one in particular, "about that legal matter." The bank door opened, revealing Curtis Hamilton himself. The banker's face was a carefully composed mask of concern. "Lieutenant Reed," he said smoothly, "this violence is most unfortunate. These men will be disciplined for their behavior." "Save it, Hamilton," Reed replied. "We both know they were following orders." Hamilton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I've no idea what you mean. If you've come about the property notice, I'm afraid there's nothing to be done. The documentation is quite clear." "I'd like to see this documentation." "It's with my lawyers in Richmond, but I assure you everything is in order." Reed stepped closer, his voice dropping so only Hamilton could hear. "You've made a mistake, Hamilton. I'm not some ignorant farmer you can intimidate with hooded men and legal fictions." "No," Hamilton agreed, his own voice equally quiet. "You're a desperate, broken man with no friends, no influence, and no future. You died at Appomattox, Reed. You just haven't stopped moving yet." Reed felt Hannah's hand on his arm, a gentle restraint. He realized how close he'd come to violence again, his right hand unconsciously forming a fist. "This isn't over," Reed said, stepping back. "On that we agree," Hamilton replied, his cordial tone returning as he addressed the crowd. "Now, I believe Sheriff Wilson will want to discuss the assault on these 4 citizens. Perhaps you should pay him a visit before leaving town." Reed scanned the faces of the townspeople. Most avoided his gaze, but a few, the blacksmith, an elderly shopkeeper, a young mother with a child, met his eyes with something like sympathy or respect. Not allies, perhaps, but not enemies either. "Let's go," he said to Hannah, turning toward their horses. As they mounted, Reed noticed Sheridan standing in the doorway of the saloon across the street. The former Union soldier raised his glass in a gesture that might have been a salute or a warning. They rode out of town in silence, the weight of what had happened and what was to come, settling between them like an approaching storm. "They'll come for us tonight," Hannah finally said as the town disappeared behind them. "After what you did to those men." Reed nodded. "Probably, but not with hoods this time, with badges and the law." "What do we do?" Reed considered the woman beside him, so different from the frightened, desperate figure of the previous night. There was steel in Hannah Turner, a determination that reminded him of the young officers who had led men into battle, not because they were fearless, but because they believed absolutely in their cause. "We prepare," he answered, "and we decide what we're willing to fight for." As they crested the hill overlooking his cabin, Reed saw smoke rising from the chimney, and Sarah standing watch on the porch. Beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains, stretched into the distance their ancient peaks indifferent to the small dramas of human lives played out in their shadows. For the first time since Appomattox, Jackson Reed felt truly alive. And for the first time, in longer than he could remember, he felt something else purpose. Hamilton's words echoed in his mind. "You died at Appomattox." Perhaps he had. But as they rode toward the cabin and whatever fate awaited them there, Reed realized that sometimes death was just the beginning of a different kind of life. Reed spent the afternoon teaching Hannah and Sarah how to load and fire his shotgun. Solomon watched from the porch, his young eyes tracking every movement, absorbing the grim education of survival in a hostile world. "Sight down the barrel, not across it," Reed instructed Hannah as she awkwardly positioned the weapon, both eyes open. Hannah's arms trembled slightly under the shotgun's weight. "I've never fired a gun before." "First time for everything," Reed replied. "The triggers differ than you'd expect. Don't jerk it, squeeze." Sarah proved a quicker study handling the weapon with unexpected familiarity. "My husband taught me," she explained, noticing Reed's raised eyebrow. "After emancipation, said freedom wasn't worth much without the means to defend it." Reed nodded. "Wise man." As the women practiced, Reed fortified the cabin's weak points, reinforcing the door with additional timber positioning furniture to provide cover calculating fields of fire. The familiar routine of preparation settled his mind, pushing back the questions that had plagued him since their return from town. Why was he doing this? These people weren't his responsibility. Their cause wasn't his fight. He had sacrificed enough for lost causes in the war. Yet when Solomon brought him water and quietly asked, "Will they kill us, Mr. Reed?" the question answered itself. Reed looked into the boy's serious eyes. "No, son, they won't. Because you'll stop them." The simple faith in the child's voice hit Reed like physical pain. When had anyone last believed in him so completely? His men, perhaps before Gettysburg, showed the futility of courage against superior numbers and artillery. "We'll all stop them," Reed said, clapping the boy's shoulder. "Together." As dusk approached, Hannah joined Reed on the porch. They stood in silence, watching the setting sun paint the Blue Ridge Mountains in shades of purple and gold. "It's beautiful," Hannah said softly. "Easy to forget there's ugliness in the world when you see something like that." "Beauty and ugliness often exist side by side," Reed replied, "sometimes in the same thing." Hannah studied his profile, the scars that ran from his temple to jaw remnants of Gettysburg, though she didn't know that. The hard lines around his mouth that suggested years of compressed pain. The eyes that had seen too much death. "Why did you fight for the Confederacy?" she asked abruptly. Reed's jaw tightened. "Why does a Northerner care? Because I'm trying to understand this place. These people. You." Reed was silent so long Hannah thought he wouldn't answer. "I was a lawyer before the war," he finally said. "Specialized in property disputes. Ironic, considering." He gestured toward the eviction notice lying on the table inside. "When Virginia seceded, I didn't own slaves. Never had. Never wanted to." "Then why fight?" "Because this was my home. Because men I respected were fighting. Because when you're 25, war sounds like glory instead of what it really is." He paused. "And because I believed the federal government had overstepped its constitutional authority." Hannah's expression tightened. "The constitutional authority to keep human beings in bondage." "I didn't say I was right," Reed replied quietly. "I said I believed it. There's a difference." Before Hannah could respond, Solomon's voice called from inside the cabin. "Riders coming?" Reed was instantly alert, moving to the doorway with fluid efficiency. Through his rifle's scope, he counted 6 men approaching not from the direction of town, but from the North Trail. As they drew closer, he relaxed slightly. "Not Hamilton's men," he told Hannah. "Looks like Newton Abernathy and his sons." "Friends of yours?" Hannah asked hopefully. "Neighbors, not exactly friends." Abernathy was a gaunt, weathered man who had fought alongside Reed at the Wilderness. His 4 sons, ranging from 16 to 24, had the hard-bitten look of men who wrested their living from stubborn soil through sheer determination. Reed stepped off the porch as they approached, his rifle visible but not threatening. "Evening, Newton," he called. "Bit late for a social call." Abernathy dismounted stiffly. Like many veterans, his body had aged beyond its years, war and hardship, etched into every movement. "Heard about the trouble in town," he said without preamble. "Hamilton's been spreading word that you've turned traitor to your own kind." "That's so? Says you attacked 4 good men unprovoked, that you're harboring northern agitators and runaways." Abernathy's eyes flicked to Hannah standing on the porch. "Says there'll be a reckoning." Reed met the older man's gaze steadily. "And you came to see for yourself. Came to warn you. Sheriff Wilson's deputized 20 men. They're planning to ride out here tonight. Make an example of you." Something like surprise flickered across Reed's face. "You're risking Hamilton's displeasure to warn me." Abernathy shrugged. "You pulled my Elijah out from under enemy fire at the Wilderness. A debt's a debt." Reed nodded a soldier's acknowledgement of a code that transcended politics and even the present conflict. "I appreciate the warning." "Do more than appreciate it. Leave, now. Take your guests and go. Nothing worth dying for out here. These people have nowhere else to go. And this land is mine, legal papers or not." Abernathy studied Reed with a mixture of respect and exasperation. "Still stubborn as a Georgia mule, I see." He sighed heavily. "Hamilton wants the whole valley, Reed, not just your patch or the schoolhouse. He's working with northern investors, railroad men. Got plans for a coal operation that'll make him rich as Croesus. So it's about money, not race or reconstruction or any of that." "It's always about money," Abernathy confirmed. "The rest is just window dressing to get ordinary folk riled up enough to do his dirty work." Reed processed this information, pieces falling into place. "How many in the sheriff's posse?" 20, maybe more by now. "Armed to the teeth. Winchester repeaters, not hunting rifles." Reed's tactical mind calculated odds and angles. 20 armed men against one one-armed veteran and 2 women with minimal firearms training. Impossible odds even with the defensive advantage of the cabin. "You should go Newton," Reed said finally. "Don't want you caught in the middle of this." Abernathy hesitated, then extended his hand. Reed took it, surprised at the gesture. "Good luck, Lieutenant," the older man said. "You were a good officer, one of the few who gave a damn whether his men lived or died." As Abernathy and his sons rode away, Hannah joined Reed in the yard. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "You heard him. They're coming in force." Reed shook his head. "If we run, we'll be hunted down within a day. Separately, most likely." "Then what's your plan? You can't seriously intend to fight off 20 armed men." Reed turned toward the cabin, his mind already formulating strategies. "Not fight, negotiate. With men who want to kill us, with men following orders. There's a difference." He paused. "Most of them are veterans like me, like Abernathy. They follow a code whether they admit it or not." "What code could possibly help us now?" Reed's expression hardened with determination. The same code that's kept me alive since Appomattox. A soldier's word is his bond, and no man of honor harms women or children. They prepared through the night. Reed knew Hamilton's men would likely wait until dawn. Night raids were messy, unpredictable, with too much potential for friendly fire. That gave them precious hours. Sarah had revealed unexpected reserves of practical ingenuity, helping Reed create defensive positions using furniture and the limited resources of the cabin. Hannah had initially balked at the preparations for violence, but eventually joined them with grim determination. Solomon had been tasked with the most important job of all. When the shooting started, he was to hide in the small root cellar beneath the cabin floor. The boy had nodded solemnly, understanding without being told that the adults were trying to shield him from the ugliest possibilities. Around midnight, as Sarah and Solomon finally slept, Reed found Hannah sitting by the fire staring into the flames. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey into tin cups and offered her one. "Dutch courage," he said, "helps steady the hands." Hannah accepted the cup but didn't drink. "Will it help steady the conscience too?" Reed settled into the chair opposite her. "Nothing helps with that." "How do you live with it? The things you've done. The things you've seen." "Who says I live with it?" Reed took a measured sip of his whiskey. "Some nights I just survive it." Hannah studied him with those direct eyes that seemed to cut through his carefully constructed barriers. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Reed." "Call me Jackson. Might as well be on a first-name basis with someone who's likely to die alongside you." The gallows humor startled a laugh from Hannah. "You're certainly cheerful about our prospects. Realistic. There's a difference." Hannah finally tasted the whiskey, wincing slightly at the burn. "Why are you helping us, Jackson? Really? It can't just be some soldier's code." Reed was silent for a long moment, watching the fire cast shadows across the sparse cabin. When he spoke, his voice was low, as if the words were being extracted against his will. "Outside Richmond, near the end, my company was assigned to patrol for deserters. We came across a settlement, mostly women and children. Someone fired a shot. We never knew who." He paused, taking another sip of whiskey. "Orders came to burn them out. Teach a lesson." Hannah sat motionless instinctively, understanding she was hearing something rarely, if ever, spoken aloud. "I didn't stop it," Reed continued. "I followed orders, watched as families fled into the night, heard the screams when some didn't make it out." His scarred face was expressionless, but his knuckles were white around the tin cup. "Found out later, they weren't deserters or sympathizers, just civilians trying to survive." "It was war," Hannah said softly. "Terrible things happen." Reed's eyes flashed. "That's the lie we tell ourselves, that war justifies atrocity. It doesn't. Nothing does." "Is that why you're helping us redemption?" "There is no redemption," Reed said flatly. "Just the chance to do better next time. To be the man I should have been then." Hannah reached across the space between them, her hand covering his. "There's always redemption, Jackson, for those who seek it." Reed didn't pull away, but neither did he acknowledge the gesture. They sat in silence as the fire burned lower, 2 strangers united by circumstance, and the knowledge that morning might bring their deaths. Dawn broke with the sound of hoofbeats. Many hoofbeats. Reed had been awake for hours, positioned at the window with his Henry rifle. Hannah and Sarah had taken up their assigned positions, Hannah at the rear window with the shotgun, Sarah by the door with Reed's revolver. "Remember," Reed said quietly, "they'll try to provoke us into firing first. Don't oblige them." Through the morning mist, Riders materialized on the road leading to the cabin, a double column of men, most wearing deputy badges, hastily pinned to their coats. At their head rode Sheriff Wilson, a corpulent man who had spent the war safely behind a desk, while younger men died in the fields. Beside him rode Curtis Hamilton, immaculate in a black suit that seemed obscenely formal against the rough backdrop of the Blue Ridge foothills. The column halted 50 yards from the cabin. Reed counted 24 men, all armed with rifles or shotguns. The odds were even worse than Abernathy had warned. "Jackson Reed," Sheriff Wilson's voice boomed across the clearing, "you are ordered to surrender yourself and turn over the fugitives in your custody. Come out with your hands visible." Reed remained motionless at the window, his rifle trained on Hamilton rather than the sheriff. A small tactical choice that wasn't lost on the banker, whose eyes widened slightly when he realized where Reed's sights were aimed. "You have 1 minute to comply before we take action," Wilson continued, his voice carrying the artificial authority of a man unused to being disobeyed. Reed finally moved to the door, positioning himself to speak without presenting a clear target. "On what charges, Sheriff?" he called back. Wilson seemed momentarily flustered by the question. "Harboring fugitives, assaulting citizens of Elkhorn Valley, resisting a lawful eviction." "The eviction notice gives me 3 days to vacate," Reed replied calmly. "Today's only day 2. As for the assault, I was defending myself against armed men. And these people aren't fugitives. They're legal residents of Virginia, with documentation from the Freedmen's Bureau." Reed's legal training was evident in his precise language, forcing Wilson to engage on matters of law rather than force. Hamilton nudged his horse forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Enough of this, Reed. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Send out the northern woman and the colored fugitives, and perhaps we can discuss leniency for yourself." "They're not fugitives, Hamilton. You know that. This is about the land, not them." A murmur ran through the assembled deputies. Reed noted with grim satisfaction that his words had struck home. Some of these men might be willing to enforce an eviction or arrest a troublemaker, but they'd been told a different story about Hannah and Sarah. "The land is mine by legal right," Hamilton replied smoothly. "The bank holds the mortgage, which was defaulted on years ago. Convenient that this mortgage only surfaced after the Freedmen's Bureau established a settlement on neighboring land. Land you need for your coal operation and railroad deal." Another ripple of surprise moved through the posse. Clearly, Hamilton hadn't shared his business plans with his recruited muscle. Hamilton's face darkened. "You're trying my patience, Reed. Send them out now, or we burn you out." Reed leveled his rifle through the narrow window. "You can try, Hamilton, but you'll be the first to die." The statement, delivered with the cold certainty of a man who had faced death many times, caused several deputies to shift uncomfortably in their saddles. 24 against 1, Reed," Wilson blustered. "You can't win." "I don't need to win," Reed replied. "I just need to make sure Hamilton never spends a penny of his blood money." The standoff stretched, tension crackling in the morning air. Reed held his position rifle unwavering while assessing the men before him. Most were local farmers or tradesmen, decent enough, men individually caught up in Hamilton's machinations. A few were clearly hired guns, their expressions professionally blank. And then there was Sheridan, sitting his horse slightly apart from the others, his Union Army coat incongruous among the largely ex-Confederate group. Their eyes met briefly through the window, soldier to soldier, across the chasm of former enmity. "This is your final warning," Wilson shouted, though his voice had lost some of its conviction. Reed was about to respond when the cabin door opened. Hannah stepped out onto the porch, unarmed, her back straight and chin high. "I am Hannah Turner," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. Representative of the Freedmen's Bureau authorized by the United States government to establish educational facilities for freed people in accordance with the Reconstruction Acts. Reed cursed under his breath. This wasn't part of the plan. She was making herself a target. But Hannah continued, pulling a document from her pocket. I have here the legal title to the adjacent property, signed by the territorial governor and the federal commissioner. This land, she gestured to the cabin and surrounding acres, was purchased in good faith by Mr. Reed from a legitimate owner. If there is a dispute about ownership, it must be resolved in a federal court, not through armed intimidation. Her words, precise, formal, and delivered with unwavering conviction, had a visible impact on the posse. These weren't just Hamilton's claims against Reed's. This was now a federal matter with potential consequences beyond the valley. Wilson looked uncertainly at Hamilton, whose face had hardened into a mask of controlled rage. The woman is lying, Hamilton said flatly. The documents are forgeries. Then let a judge determine that, Hannah countered. Or are you afraid of legal scrutiny, Mr. Hamilton? Perhaps because your own claims might not withstand examination. It was a direct challenge, and everyone present understood its implications. Hamilton's hand moved toward his coat, where Reed knew he carried a derringer. Get back inside, Reed called urgently to Hannah. But before she could move, a new voice joined the confrontation. I'd listen to the lieutenant if I were you, ma'am. James Sheridan urged his horse forward, breaking ranks with the posse. He positioned himself between Hannah and the others, his back to the cabin. Sheridan, what the hell do you think you're doing? Hamilton demanded. Something I should have done at the beginning, Sheridan replied. He turned to address the posse. Some of you fought under me at Antietam and the Wilderness. Others fought against me. But we all know what it means to give our word, to follow a code. He paused, making eye contact with several of the veterans among the deputies. This isn't about law. It's about money. Hamilton's money. He's using us, using our badges and our guns to steal land that rightfully belongs to others. Wilson sputtered in outrage, but his voice was drowned out by the murmurs of the men behind him. Reed watched with growing amazement as several deputies lowered their rifles. Damn your eyes, Sheridan! Hamilton's voice cracked with fury. I paid you good money. Not enough to make me forget who I am, Sheridan replied quietly. The tableau held for a long, breathless moment Hannah on the porch. Sheridan positioned protectively before her, the posse wavering in their resolve. Then Hamilton made his move, drawing his derringer with practiced speed and aiming at Sheridan. Reed fired first. The Henry's report cracked across the clearing as Hamilton's horse reared in panic, the bullet striking inches from the banker's head, a deliberate miss, but an unmistakable warning. Chaos erupted. Deputies scattered, some taking cover, others retreating toward the road. Wilson's horse bolted with the sheriff still clinging desperately to the saddle. Hamilton regained control of his mount and galloped after Wilson, shouting orders that went unheeded in the confusion. Within minutes, the clearing was empty, except for Sheridan, who remained on his horse facing the cabin. You missed on purpose, Reed, he called. Your reputation as a marksman remains intact. Reed emerged cautiously from the cabin rifle still at the ready. Why the change of heart, Sheridan? The former Union officer dismounted slowly, hands visible. Let's just say I've spent 3 years trying to forget what I saw and did during the war. Turns out forgetting isn't the same as healing. Hannah approached her expression a mixture of relief and wariness. Will they come back? Not today, Sheridan replied. Hamilton's lost face. He'll need time to regroup, find new allies. He turned to Reed. But they will come back, with more men, fewer scruples, and a better plan. Reed nodded grimly. How much time do we have? A day, maybe two. Sheridan hesitated. There's something else you should know, Reed. About Company 7. Reed's face hardened. What about them? Sheridan met his gaze steadily. The incident outside Richmond. The settlement that was burned. He paused. It wasn't your unit that fired the first shot. It was mine. The words hit Reed like a physical blow. What? We were positioned on the ridge above. Had orders to flush out Confederate pickets. One of my men got nervous, fired early. Started the whole thing. Sheridan's voice was steady, but his eyes reflected old guilt. I've carried that for 3 years. Thought you should know. Reed stood motionless, processing this revelation. The burden he'd carried since Richmond, the weight of those civilian deaths, shifted slightly on his shoulders. Not lifted entirely, but changed in some fundamental way. Why tell me this now? He finally asked. Because I saw your face when Hamilton threatened the boy. Sheridan answered simply. Same look you had that night in Richmond. A man who'll do anything to protect the innocent, even from his own side. He extended his hand. Thought such a man deserved the truth. Reed stared at the offered hand, the hand of a former enemy, now perhaps an ally. After a long moment, he took it. Truth's a rare commodity these days, he said quietly. Rarer than courage, Sheridan agreed. And you'll need both before this is over. By midday, the cabin had become a hive of activity. Sheridan's defection had bought them time, but everyone understood it was temporary. Hamilton would return, and when he did, he'd bring enough men to ensure the outcome wasn't in doubt. Reed and Sheridan sat at the rough-hewn table mapping defensive positions on a scrap of paper. Their shared military experience created an unexpected synergy as they assessed terrain approaches and vulnerabilities. The ridge offers the best cover, Sheridan was saying, indicating the wooded slope behind the cabin. If they come in force, that's your escape route. Reed shook his head. Too obvious. Hamilton will have men positioned to cut off that retreat. Then where? Reed traced a faint line on the crude map. Old Game Trail. Runs along the creek bottom hidden by brush. Leads to a cave system about 2 miles west. Sarah, who had been listening nearby while preparing a meager midday meal, spoke up. You know these hills well for someone who's only lived here 3 years. Had to know something about the land I was buying, Reed replied. Spent weeks exploring before settling on this spot. Hannah joined them, spreading out a set of documents on the table. I've been reviewing the land titles. There's something strange here. She pointed to a name on one of the yellowed pages. The original owner of this parcel was Jonathan Hamilton. Any relation to our friend Curtis? His father, Sheridan confirmed. Old Jonathan was a different breed, though. Fair man even to those he considered beneath him. Died early in the war. Hannah frowned, comparing documents. According to this, Jonathan Hamilton sold this land to Samuel Winters in 1858. Then Winters sold it to you, Reed, in 65. Hamilton's claim that the bank holds the mortgage doesn't make sense. Unless the mortgage was with the bank, not with Hamilton personally, Reed suggested. But look at this. Hannah indicated a clause in small print. Winters paid cash. There was no mortgage. Reed and Sheridan exchanged glances. Hamilton's claim is fraudulent, Reed concluded. He forged the mortgage documents. That would be my guess, Sheridan agreed. But proving it is another matter. The county records office burned mysteriously last year. Convenient for anyone wanting to make dubious land claims. Solomon, who had been quietly listening from his perch near the fireplace, spoke up. Mama has papers, too, about our land. All eyes turned to the boy, then to Sarah, who looked uncomfortable with the sudden attention. Solomon, that's private family business, she admonished gently. "But Mr. Reed is trying to help us," the boy protested. "And the papers might be important." Reed studied Sarah with new interest. "What papers, Sarah?" She hesitated, then sighed heavily. "My grandfather was free before the war. He purchased 40 acres near the creek land that's now part of the settlement where we were living. Before he died, he left papers proving ownership to my father, who passed them to me." "Why haven't you mentioned this before?" Hannah asked, clearly surprised. "Because papers don't mean much to colored folk around here," Sarah replied with quiet dignity. "My father tried to assert his claim after emancipation. He was found hanging from an oak tree the next morning." The brutal reality of her words silenced the room. It was Sheridan who finally spoke. "Where are these papers now?" "Hidden in the settlement church, under a loose floorboard beneath the pulpit." Reed stood abruptly. "We need those documents. If they prove prior ownership, they could invalidate Hamilton's claims to the entire parcel." "The settlement is under guard," Sheridan warned. "Hamilton's men have been watching it since the school burning." "Then we'll need a distraction," Reed said, military planning evident in his tone. "And we'll need to move tonight." Hannah shook her head. "It's too dangerous. Hamilton will be expecting something like this." "Which is why it has to be me," Reed replied. "Alone." "Not alone," Sheridan corrected. "I'm coming with you." Reed raised an eyebrow. "Thought you were done fighting other people's battles." "This isn't about other people anymore," Sheridan answered quietly. "It's about who I am, who we both are." The two former enemies regarded each other with the complex understanding that can only exist between men who have seen the worst of humanity and still choose to believe in its potential for better. "We leave at midnight," Reed finally said. "Sarah will guide us to the church." "And us?" Hannah asked, gesturing to herself and Solomon. Reed's expression softened slightly as he looked at them. "You'll wait here with the horses saddled and ready. If we're not back by dawn, you ride for the federal garrison at Fort Wilson. Don't stop, don't look back." Hannah opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again, recognizing the logic of his plan. "Be careful," she said instead, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that communicated far more than her words. Reed nodded once, acutely aware of how much had changed in the brief time since Hannah Turner had entered his life. For years he had existed rather than lived, a ghost haunting the periphery of a world that had moved on without him. Now suddenly he had a purpose again. People who depended on him. A cause worth fighting, perhaps even dying for. As the afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the rough floorboards, Reed felt a sensation he hadn't experienced since before Appomattox Hope. Night fell with the suddenness peculiar to mountain regions, darkness flowing down from the peaks like spilled ink. Reed and Sheridan prepared in silence, checking weapons, blackening their faces with ash from the fireplace, memorizing the crude map Sarah had drawn of the settlement. Hannah busied herself gathering supplies for their potential escape: food, water, blankets, ammunition. Her movements were precise and efficient, belying the anxiety evident in her eyes. As midnight approached, Reed found her alone on the porch, staring at the star-filled sky. "Beautiful night," he observed, standing beside her. "Too beautiful for what you're about to do," Hannah replied softly. Reed glanced at her profile, illuminated by starlight. In another life, a life without war and its aftermath, he might have met someone like Hannah Turner at a social gathering, might have courted her properly with flowers and poetry instead of gunpowder and desperate plans. "Why did you really come south, Hannah?" he asked suddenly. "The truth." She turned to face him, surprised by the question. "I told you. The Freedmen's Bureau." "That's what you did, not why." Hannah was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the darkness. "My brother died at Antietam," she finally said. "Thomas, he was 20, believed absolutely in the Union cause, in freedom for all men." Reed nodded, understanding beginning to dawn. After the war, when the Bureau was recruiting teachers, it felt like a way to continue what he started, to make his death mean something. Her voice caught slightly. "Naive, I suppose." "Not naive," Reed said quietly. "Honorable. What about you? After everything the war took from you, your arm, your faith, your future, why stay and fight now? You could leave. Start over, somewhere else." Reed considered the question, searching for an answer that would make sense to her and to himself. "Because running doesn't work," he finally said. "I tried that for 3 years. The ghosts follow you." Hannah's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. "Be careful tonight," she whispered. "Come back." The simple request contained layers of meaning that neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Reed squeezed her hand once, then released it, as Sheridan and Sarah emerged from the cabin. "It's time," Sheridan said softly. Reed nodded the soldier once more, replacing the man. "Remember, if we're not back by dawn, don't wait. Get Solomon to Fort Wilson." Hannah's eyes glistened in the starlight. "We'll be here." The 3 figures melted into the darkness, following the hidden game trail that wound through the dense undergrowth toward the settlement. They moved in silence, Reed in the lead, Sarah between the 2 men, Sheridan covering their rear. The night embraced them, the darkness both ally and enemy, as they embarked on a mission that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of the valley itself. None of them saw the lone rider observing the cabin from the distant ridge, a rider who turned his horse toward town as soon as they disappeared into the forest. The settlement lay quiet, under the star-filled sky, a cluster of simple cabins, and one small church nestled in a clearing by Elkhorn Creek. From their position in the forest edge, Reed counted 4 guards, Hamilton's men patrolling with rifles slung across their backs. "Predictable patrol pattern," Sheridan whispered. 15 minutes for a complete circuit. We'll have a 5-minute window at the north corner." Reed nodded, impressed, despite himself, at how quickly the former Union officer had assessed the situation. "Sarah, where exactly is the church?" Sarah pointed to a small white building at the settlement's center. "There. The papers are beneath the 3rd floorboard under the pulpit. You'll need to pry it up." Reed studied the terrain, calculating angles and cover. "Sheridan, you create a distraction at the south perimeter. Draw the guards away. I'll slip in, find the documents." "What about me?" Sarah asked. "You stay here," Reed replied firmly. "If something goes wrong, you'll need to get back to Hannah and Solomon." Sarah's expression hardened with determination. "Those are my family's papers, my heritage. I'm coming with you." Reed started to argue, then recognized the resolve in her eyes, the same determination that had kept her alive through slavery war and the dangerous uncertainty of supposed freedom. "Stay close," he finally said. "Do exactly as I tell you." They waited in silence, watching the guards complete another circuit. When the moment came, Sheridan slipped away, circling to the southern edge of the settlement. Minutes later, the crack of a rifle shot shattered the night's quiet. Then another. Shouts erupted as the guards ran toward the sound. "Now," Reed whispered, and they moved 2 shadows gliding across open ground toward the church. The door creaked softly as Reed eased it open. Inside, moonlight filtered through simple stained glass, casting colored patterns across wooden pews. Sarah led the way to the pulpit, a crude platform at the room's far end. "Here," she said, kneeling before it. Third board from the wall. Reed drew his knife, working the blade into the seam between floorboards. The wood protested, then yielded with a groan. Sarah reached into the dark space, feeling around, before her fingers closed on something solid. "Got it," she whispered, withdrawing an oilskin packet. Outside, the distraction continued. More shots, men shouting confusion expertly orchestrated by Sheridan. But Reed tensed, sensing something wrong. The guards had responded too quickly, too eagerly, almost as if, "It's a trap," he realized aloud. "They were waiting for us." As if confirming his words, the church door burst open. Silhouetted against the night sky stood Curtis Hamilton, flanked by two armed men. "Lieutenant Reed," Hamilton said with mock cordiality, "how predictable you've become in your old age." Reed pushed Sarah behind him, calculating odds. 3 armed men at the door, likely more outside. The only other exit was a small window behind the pulpit. "How did you know?" Reed asked, buying time, as he subtly positioned himself to shield Sarah's retreat. Hamilton smiled coldly. "Did you really think Sheridan's little performance this morning fooled anyone? He's been my man from the beginning. Played his part admirably, I must say." The revelation hit Reed like a physical blow. Sheridan. The camaraderie between soldiers, the shared understanding, all a calculated deception. "Sarah," Reed whispered urgently. "When I move, run for the window. The documents, take them, go, now." Reed lunged forward, his Henry rifle swinging toward Hamilton. The banker ducked as his men opened fire. Wood splintered around Reed as he returned fire, the familiar rhythm of combat enveloping him. One of Hamilton's men fell. The other retreated to the doorway. Hamilton himself had disappeared into the darkness outside. Reed backed toward the pulpit, firing controlled bursts to keep the remaining gunman pinned down. Sarah had reached the window, forcing it open with desperate strength. "Go!" Reed shouted as he reloaded. Sarah hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you. Get to Hannah and Solomon." She climbed through the window just as more men entered the church. Reed fired again, then again, keeping them at bay long enough for Sarah to escape into the night. He was preparing to follow when searing pain exploded in his shoulder. He staggered, nearly dropping his rifle. A second shot grazed his temple, sending him to his knees. Through blurred vision, Reed saw a figure step from the shadows beside the door. James Sheridan revolver still smoking in his hand. "I truly am sorry, Reed," Sheridan said, approaching cautiously. "For what it's worth, I meant what I said about Richmond. That part was true." Reed raised his rifle with trembling hands, but Sheridan was faster. The revolver cracked again. Darkness claimed Jackson Reed as he collapsed to the church floor, blood pooling beneath him. Consciousness returned in fragments. Pain, voices, movement. Reed's first coherent thought was surprise that he wasn't dead. His second was an assessment of his injuries. Gunshot wound to the left shoulder, bullet still lodged inside. Graze wound to the temple. Painful, debilitating, but not immediately fatal. He kept his eyes closed, feigning unconsciousness, as he tried to determine his situation. "Need him alive for the trial," Hamilton's voice was saying. "Public example of what happens to those who interfere with progress." "He's lost a lot of blood," another voice responded. Reed recognized the town doctor Peterson. "Can't guarantee he'll last till morning without proper treatment." "Then provide proper treatment," Hamilton snapped. "I didn't go to all this trouble just to have him die before he can be publicly hanged." "And the woman," a third voice, Sheridan. "Still searching. She can't have gotten far." Hamilton sounded unconcerned. More importantly, did she have the documents? Couldn't tell in the dark, Sheridan replied. But if she did, they won't help her. Word just came from Richmond Judge Harwood has agreed to preside over a special session tomorrow. Our legal position is secure. Hamilton's laugh was coldly satisfied. Excellent. By this time tomorrow, the entire valley will be mine legally. The railroad contract can proceed as planned. Footsteps receded, leaving Reed alone with Dr. Peterson. He felt the doctor's hands probing his wound none too gently. "I know you're awake, Reed," Peterson said quietly. "Don't try to talk. They've stationed guards outside." Reed opened his eyes. He lay on a cot in what appeared to be a storeroom, possibly in the sheriff's office. His hands were shackled to the frame. "How bad?" he managed to ask. "You'll live, for now." Peterson continued cleaning the shoulder wound. "Bullet missed anything vital. You've been lucky." "Doesn't feel like luck." Reed grimaced as the doctor probed deeper. This is going to hurt," Peterson warned, then extracted the bullet with a swift motion that sent waves of agony through Reed's body. "There. That should reduce the risk of infection." As the doctor bandaged the wound, Reed assessed his situation. Chained, injured, and guarded. Escape seemed impossible. But Sarah had gotten away with the documents. If she reached Hannah and Solomon in time— "What time is it?" Reed asked. "Just past 4 in the morning." Peterson's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're bringing in a judge from Richmond. Kangaroo Court set for noon tomorrow. Hamilton's not taking any chances this time." The settlement. Surrounded. Hamilton's men are searching every building. If your friends were headed there, they won't find sanctuary. Reed closed his eyes, calculating. Sarah knew the escape plan. If she'd gotten clear of the settlement, she'd be making her way back to the cabin. From there, Hannah would follow his instructions, ride for Fort Wilson by dawn. They might make it. If Sheridan hadn't revealed that plan, too. Peterson finished his work gathering his medical supplies. "That's all I can do for now. Try to rest." As the doctor moved to leave, Reed called softly after him. "Peterson, why are you telling me this?" The older man paused at the door. "My son died at Cold Harbor, 19th Virginia. Your unit pulled his body from the field during the truce. Gave him a proper burial. Some debts can't be repaid, but they can be acknowledged." With that he was gone, leaving Reed alone with his pain and the growing realization that the web Hamilton had woven was far more extensive than he'd imagined. Dawn broke over Elkhorn Valley with the promise of a beautiful late spring day, oblivious to the human drama unfolding beneath its splendor. Reed dozed fitfully, waking fully, when the storeroom door opened to admit Curtis Hamilton. The banker was freshly shaved and impeccably dressed, as if preparing for a social event rather than an execution. "Good morning, Lieutenant," Hamilton said pleasantly. "I trust Dr. Peterson made you comfortable." Reed remained silent, conserving his strength and studying his adversary. "Nothing to say. That's unlike you." Hamilton pulled up a chair, seating himself with casual elegance. "I thought you might appreciate knowing that your associates have thus far eluded capture. A remarkable feat, considering the resources at my disposal." Hope flickered in Reed's chest, quickly suppressed before it could show on his face. "Of course, it's only a matter of time," Hamilton continued. "The colored woman and boy will likely head for the federal garrison, but they won't make it. As for Miss Turner," he smiled thinly. "Well, a white woman traveling alone in these mountains faces particular dangers. My men have instructions to bring her to me, unharmed for the most part." Reed lunged against his restraints, pain forgotten in a surge of protective fury. The chains held, but his reaction clearly pleased Hamilton. "Ah, there it is. I wondered if you'd developed feelings for our northern visitor. How touching. Hamilton leaned closer. And how useful. What do you want, Hamilton? Reed finally spoke, his voice rough from thirst and pain. Want I already have what I want. Hamilton gestured expansively. By sunset, I'll own the entire Elkhorn Valley. The judge arriving from Richmond is an old friend and substantial investor in our railroad venture. The trial is a formality. Then why are you here? Hamilton's smile faded, revealing the cold calculation beneath his genteel facade. I want you to understand why you've lost Reed. It's not because I outmaneuvered you, though I did. It's because you never understood what was truly at stake. Enlighten me, Reed said flatly. The future. Hamilton stood pacing the small room with the energy of absolute conviction. This valley, this entire region is poised to enter a new era of prosperity. Coal mines, railways, industry, progress. But that future cannot be built on unstable foundations. Unstable. People like your Miss Turner and her colored charges. Their vision of a new South where former slaves become landowners, where Northern ideas contaminate Southern traditions, that's the unstable foundation I refer to. Hamilton's voice hardened. I'm not just securing land, Reed. I'm securing the proper social order. Reed studied the man before him, seeing past the veneer of civilization to the ruthlessness beneath. There's a word for men like you, Hamilton, the kind who drape greed in the flag of progress and wrap hatred in the language of tradition. And what word is that? Hamilton asked, amused. Coward? Reed met his gaze steadily. You hide behind hoods and legal papers because you're afraid. Afraid of a world where your money and your color aren't enough to guarantee your position. Hamilton's face tightened momentarily before he regained his composure. Brave words from a chained man. I wonder if you'll maintain that courage at noon when Judge Harwood pronounces your sentence. He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. One last chance, Reed. Tell me where they're likely headed, and I might be persuaded to recommend leniency. Reed's answer was silence, hard and unyielding as the mountains themselves. Very well. Hamilton straightened his already immaculate coat. I'll see you at noon, Lieutenant. Do try to look presentable for your hanging. The morning crawled by with excruciating slowness. Reed tested his restraints repeatedly, finding them secure, but noting a slight weakness in one chain's connection to the cot frame. Given hours, he might work it loose. But hours were precisely what he didn't have. Outside his improvised cell, Elkhorn Valley buzzed with activity. Voices filtered through the thin walls, townspeople gathering horses, arriving the sounds of a community preparing for the spectacle of justice, or rather its perversion. Around 11, the door opened again. Sheriff Wilson entered, flanked by 2 deputies. Time to make yourself presentable, Reed, Wilson announced, tossing a clean shirt onto the cot. Judge Harwood insists on proper decorum in his court. Reed eyed the lawman with contempt. Hard to change with these on, he said, rattling his chains. Wilson nodded to his deputies. Unshackle him, but watch him close. He's still dangerous, even wounded. As the deputies cautiously unlocked his restraints, Reed assessed his options. 3 armed men, his injured shoulders severely limiting his fighting ability. Even if he somehow overpowered them, the town was filled with Hamilton's supporters. The odds were impossible. But Reed had faced impossible odds before at Gettysburg and the Wilderness. Sometimes survival meant waiting for the right moment, not the first moment. He changed shirts with deliberate slowness, using the opportunity to test his shoulders' mobility. The pain was intense, but manageable. More concerning was the lightheadedness from blood loss. He would have one chance at best, and it would need to count. "Let's go," Wilson ordered when Reed had finished. "Judge is waiting." They escorted him through the sheriff's office into the bright sunlight of midday. Reed squinted against the sudden glare, taking in the scene before him. The town square had been transformed. A temporary platform stood before the courthouse steps, serving as an impromptu judicial bench. Seated behind it was Judge Harwood, a corpulent man with mutton-chop whiskers and the florid complexion of a dedicated drinker. Beside him sat Curtis Hamilton, immaculate in black, his expression one of contained satisfaction. Facing the platform were rows of chairs filled with townspeople, some Reed recognized, others strangers likely drawn by news of the trial. At the edges stood armed men, Hamilton's private security ensuring the proceedings went according to plan. They led Reed to a solitary chair before the platform, positioning deputies on either side. No defense counsel, no jury, just the accused facing his accusers. Judge Harwood cleared his throat importantly. Court is now in session. The Commonwealth of Virginia versus Jackson Reed on charges of harboring fugitives, resisting lawful authority assault upon citizens of Elkhorn Valley, and seditious conspiracy against the legitimate government. The charges were absurd, designed to justify a predetermined outcome. Reed remained silent, scanning the crowd for any potential allies. His gaze settled on Newton Abernathy, standing at the back with his sons. The old veteran's face was unreadable, but he met Reed's eyes steadily. "How does the accused plead?" Harwood demanded. "This isn't a legitimate court," Reed replied evenly. "You have no jurisdiction in a property dispute already under federal review." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Harwood banged his gavel. "The accused will enter a plea or be considered in contempt." "Then I'm in contempt," Reed answered calmly, "as is this entire proceeding." Hamilton leaned over, whispering something to Harwood. The judge nodded, then addressed the crowd. "Given the defendant's refusal to cooperate and the serious nature of these charges, the court will proceed directly to the presentation of evidence." He gestured to Hamilton. "Mr. Hamilton, you may present your case." What followed was a masterpiece of judicial corruption. Hamilton called a parade of witnesses, men who testified to Reed's unprovoked assault in town, others who claimed he had threatened them when they tried to deliver legal papers, still others who swore he had harbored known criminals. Throughout, Reed remained silent, conserving his strength and studying the crowd. Most avoided his gaze, uncomfortable with the proceedings, but unwilling to challenge Hamilton's authority. A few Abernathy among them watched with expressions that suggested they recognized the travesty unfolding before them. "And finally," Hamilton concluded after nearly an hour of damning testimony, "I call James Sheridan to the stand." Sheridan approached, his military bearing evident despite civilian clothes. He avoided Reed's eyes as he took his position before the judge. "Mr. Sheridan, please tell the court what you witnessed at the Reed property." Sheridan cleared his throat. "I observed the defendant harboring two fugitives, a colored woman named Sarah Johnson and her son, both wanted for questioning in the burning of the Morrison farm last month. Additionally, he was sheltering a northern agitator, Hannah Turner, who has been inciting unrest among the colored population." "And what happened when lawful authorities attempted to apprehend these individuals?" Reed threatened Sheriff Wilson and his deputies with deadly force, declaring he would shoot any man who approached his property. The testimony continued, each word driving another nail into Reed's coffin. When Hamilton finally concluded his questioning, Reed surprised everyone by speaking up. "I'd like to cross-examine the witness." But Harwood frowned. "You've waived your right to counsel by refusing to enter a plea." "Nevertheless, I have the right to question witnesses against me." unless this is merely theater with a predetermined conclusion. The challenge hung in the air. Even Harwood seemed momentarily discomfited by the naked truth of Reed's statement. "Very well," the judge finally conceded. "You may question the witness, briefly." Reed rose slowly, ignoring the pain that shot through his wounded shoulder. He approached Sheridan, who finally met his gaze with a mixture of defiance and something else, perhaps regret. "Mr. Sheridan," Reed began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed square. "You served in the Union Army during the war, correct?" Sheridan nodded. "That's correct. At Antietam, where you faced my unit across Bloody Lane." Another nod, more cautious. "We were enemies then. Yet, when I saw you in town, I addressed you as soldier, not enemy." "Why do you think I did that?" Sheridan hesitated, clearly uncertain where Reed was leading. "Military courtesy, I suppose." "No, because soldiers follow a code. Whether they wear blue or gray, north or south, certain principles transcend the divisions of war." Reed's voice strengthened. "Truth, honor, protection of the innocent." He turned to address the crowd directly. "Many of you fought. You know the code I speak of. It's why Abernathy warned me about the sheriff's posse. Why Dr. Peterson treated my wounds despite orders to let me suffer." Murmurs rippled through the assembled townspeople. Reed continued, his words measured and clear. "This man," he gestured to Sheridan, "betrayed that code. Not because he chose Hamilton's side. Men can disagree honorably. But because he lied. Pretended to stand for principles while secretly undermining them." Reed turned back to Sheridan. "One question, soldier to soldier. When you shot me in that church, was it for money or something else?" For a long moment, Sheridan was silent, conflict evident in his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but carried in the absolute silence that had fallen. "Hamilton has papers from the war, evidence that could see me hanged as a war criminal." He swallowed hard. "Things I did during Sherman's march, things no man should have done, even in war." The admission hung in the air, raw and unexpected. Reed nodded slowly, understanding dawning. Blackmail, not greed, had motivated Sheridan's betrayal. "So he owns you," Reed said quietly, "just as he intends to own this valley, and everyone in it." "That's enough." Hamilton's voice cracked through the square like a whip. "Judge Harwood, I must insist that these irrelevant ramblings cease immediately." Harwood banged his gavel. "The defendant will return to his seat. Any further disruptions will result in immediate sentencing." Reed held his ground. "The people of this valley deserve to know what's truly at stake. This isn't about me or even about the school. It's about Hamilton's plan to turn Elkhorn Valley into a coal operation that will destroy your farms, poison your water, and leave you as dependent on his company as any slave was to his master." "Guards!" Hamilton shouted. "Restrain the prisoner!" Deputies moved to grab Reed, but he continued speaking, his voice rising to carry over the growing commotion. "Hamilton doesn't care about tradition or racial purity or any of the things he claims to defend. He cares about money, your land, your futures, all sacrificed for his profit." The first deputy reached him, grabbing his injured shoulder. Reed gasped in pain, but didn't resist as they forced him back to his chair. "Judge Harwood," Hamilton said, his composure cracking slightly, "I believe we've heard more than enough. The evidence is clear. I request an immediate verdict." Harwood nodded, eager to regain control of the proceedings. "Given the overwhelming evidence and the defendant's disruptive behavior, this court finds Jackson Reed guilty on all charges. Sentencing will be—" "Wait!" a voice called from the back of the crowd. The assembled townspeople turned as one. Hannah Turner stood at the edge of the square, flanked by Sarah and Solomon. Behind them, to Reed's astonishment, were two men in the unmistakable blue uniforms of federal marshals. "This proceeding is unlawful," Hannah announced, her voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "I have here a federal injunction prohibiting any local action regarding the disputed properties until a proper hearing can be conducted." She held up an official-looking document as she moved forward through the crowd, which parted before her like water. The federal marshals followed, hands resting meaningfully on their holstered revolvers. "Furthermore," Hannah continued, reaching the front of the assembly, "I have evidence that Mr. Hamilton has engaged in systematic fraud, forgery of legal documents, and intimidation of witnesses." She placed Sarah's oilskin packet on the judge's table. "These papers, verified by the land office in Richmond this morning, prove that the property in question was legally purchased by Samuel Winters from Jonathan Hamilton in 1858 with no mortgage or encumbrance. Additionally, they confirm that the settlement land was legally deeded to the family of Sarah Johnson before the war." Harwood sputtered, looking to Hamilton for guidance, but the banker had gone pale, his eyes fixed on the documents before him. "Those papers were destroyed," he said hoarsely. "The records office fire. Copies were filed with the Federal Land Office," Hannah replied calmly, "as was standard practice for transactions involving freed people before the war. Your father was more thorough and more honorable than you anticipated, Mr. Hamilton." One of the federal marshals stepped forward. "Judge Harwood, this court has no jurisdiction in this matter. The prisoner is to be released immediately into federal custody, pending a full investigation." Harwood looked desperately toward Hamilton, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the past few minutes. The banker's face worked through a series of emotions: shock, rage, calculation, before settling into a mask of cold determination. "This changes nothing," he said, rising to his feet. "These so-called marshals have no authority here. This is a Virginia court, deciding Virginia matters." "Actually," the marshal replied, "under the Reconstruction Act's federal authority supersedes state and local jurisdiction in matters involving former Confederates, freedmen, and land disputes arising from the war. Your own Judge Harwood knows this, don't you, Your Honor?" All eyes turned to Harwood, whose florid face had drained of color. He knew, and more importantly, he knew that his involvement in Hamilton's schemes might now come under federal scrutiny. "The court," he began haltingly, "the court acknowledges the federal jurisdiction in this matter. The prisoner is ordered released pending further proceedings." Hamilton's face contorted with fury. "You gutless coward! After everything I've done for you!" His hand moved beneath his coat, reaching for the derringer he habitually carried. Reed saw the motion and lunged forward, despite his chains crashing into Hamilton just as the small pistol appeared. They fell together, struggling for control of the weapon. Pain exploded through Reed's wounded shoulder as Hamilton drove a knee into it. The derringer discharged the bullet, harmlessly embedding itself in the wooden platform. Reed felt his strength failing, the blood loss and injury taking their toll. Then suddenly, Hamilton's weight was gone. Reed looked up to see Sheridan holding the banker by the collar, the derringer now in his own hand. "That's enough, Hamilton," Sheridan said quietly. "It's over." "You traitor," Hamilton gasped. "After everything I've done for you." Sheridan's face was grim. "No. After everything you've forced me to do. There's a difference." The federal marshals moved in, taking custody of Hamilton, who continued to struggle and shout threats. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the man who had dominated their valley for years was reduced to a spitting, cursing prisoner. Reed felt gentle hands helping him to his feet. "Hannah, Her face was streaked with dust from the road, her clothes torn and dirty, but her eyes shone with triumph and relief. "You came back," Reed said, his voice barely audible. "I said I would," she replied simply. "How?" "Sarah found us on the trail. We rode all night to reach Fort Wilson, then back to Richmond with the federal marshals." She supported him as his legs threatened to buckle. "The land office opened early for us, apparently. A judge has significant influence when properly motivated." Reed looked past her to Sarah and Solomon standing close together, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and cautious hope. "The papers?" he asked. "Legitimate," Hannah confirmed. "Sarah's family has owned that land since 1855, and your purchase from Winters was completely legal. Hamilton's entire claim was fraudulent." The implications were still filtering through Reed's pain-fogged mind when Newton Abernathy approached his sons, flanking him protectively. "Hell of a show, Lieutenant," the old veteran said, genuine respect in his voice. "Might be the first honest court proceeding this valley's seen in years." Reed managed a wry smile. "Not sure how honest it was, but justice seems to have prevailed for once." Abernathy nodded gravely. "That it has. Question is, what happens next?" It was a question Reed had no immediate answer for. The future, something he hadn't properly considered since Appomattox suddenly stretched before him, filled with possibilities both promising and frightening. But before he could formulate a response, his legs finally gave way. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Hannah's face, her expression shifting from triumph to alarm as he collapsed into her arms. Reed dreamed of fire, not the indiscriminate destruction of battle, but the controlled warmth of a hearth. He was a boy again, sitting before his family's fireplace, while his father read aloud from Shakespeare, and his mother's knitting needles clicked a gentle counterpoint to the crackling flames. Safety, home, peace. He opened his eyes to find himself in an unfamiliar room, lying on a proper bed with clean linens. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting dappled patterns across a simple but well-appointed chamber. For a disorienting moment, he wondered if he had somehow been transported back in time to the world before war had shattered everything familiar. "Welcome back," a voice said softly. Hannah sat in a chair beside the bed, a book open in her lap. She looked different, her hair loose around her shoulders, her dress a simple calico, rather than the practical traveling clothes he'd grown accustomed to seeing her in. "Where?" Reed's voice was a dry croak. Hannah reached for a glass of water on the bedside table, helping him drink. "Judge Williams's home, in Richmond. You've been unconscious for nearly 3 days." Reed tried to sit up, wincing as pain lanced through his shoulder. 3 days. Dr. Peterson's treatment was rudimentary. The wound became infected during the journey here. You've been feverish." Her hand rested briefly against his forehead. "Better now, though." Reed sank back against the pillows, processing this information. "Hamilton, in federal custody along with Sheriff Wilson and Judge Harwood. They'll stand trial for conspiracy fraud and, in Hamilton's case, attempted murder." Hannah's expression was grim satisfaction tinged with weariness. "The federal prosecutor seems quite eager to make an example of them." "And Sheridan," Hannah hesitated. "Cooperating with the authorities in exchange for leniency regarding his actions during the war." Reed nodded, understanding the complex moral calculus at play. Sheridan had done terrible things both during the war and after, but in the end, he had chosen the right side even at great personal cost. "Sarah and Solomon, safe. They're staying with friends from the Freedmen's Bureau while the land titles are properly registered." Hannah smiled slightly. "Solomon has been asking about you daily. He's quite convinced you're the bravest man in Virginia." Reed snorted softly. "Brave or foolish? Fine line between the two." "Indeed." Hannah's expression grew more serious. The federal court has scheduled a hearing next week regarding all the disputed properties in Elkhorn Valley. Your testimony will be crucial once you're well enough to travel. Reed absorbed this, his tactical mind already assessing implications and potential outcomes. And after the hearing, what happens to the valley? That remains to be decided. But with Hamilton's scheme exposed, there's an opportunity to shape a different future. Hannah hesitated, then added, the Freedmen's Bureau is considering establishing a model community there, a place where former slaves and poor whites could work together with proper education for all children and fair allocation of resources. Ambitious, Reed observed, and likely to face significant resistance from those who prefer the old order. Most worthwhile endeavors face resistance, Hannah replied simply. That doesn't make them any less worth pursuing. They fell silent, the weight of recent events and future possibilities hanging between them. Reed studied Hannah's face, noting the subtle changes, a new confidence in her bearing, a depth in her eyes that spoke of hard-won wisdom. She had entered his life as an idealistic schoolteacher. Now she seemed something more, a woman who had faced violence and injustice and emerged stronger, her convictions tempered rather than broken. "Thank you," he said finally, "for coming back, for not running to safety when you had the chance." Hannah met his gaze steadily. "I told you I would be there. I keep my promises, Jackson Reed." The use of his full name spoken with such quiet certainty stirred something in Reed's chest, a warmth he had thought long extinguished by war and its aftermath. "As do I," he replied softly. Before either could say more, the bedroom door opened to admit a distinguished older man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Judge Williams Reed presumed. "Ah, our patient is awake," the judge observed with satisfaction. "Excellent. Miss Turner has been most diligent in her vigil, Lieutenant Reed. Barely left your side these past days." Hannah colored slightly but didn't contradict him. "I'm grateful for the care, Your Honor," Reed replied formally. "And for your hospitality." Williams waved this away. "Least I could do." Miss Turner's account of events in Elkhorn Valley was most disturbing. Men like Hamilton do the reconstruction effort no favors. He frowned thoughtfully. "Though I must say your own situation presents certain complexities." "Complexities? You're a former Confederate officer who hasn't taken the loyalty oath," Williams explained. "Technically, you're ineligible to own property or participate fully in civic life until you do so." Reed tensed. The loyalty oath required of all former Confederates before their citizenship rights could be restored had been a bitter point of contention throughout the South. Many saw it as humiliation, a formal surrender more devastating than Appomattox. "I understand," he said stiffly. "However," Williams continued, "your actions in defense of federal policy and freedmen's rights place you in a unique category. I've taken the liberty of speaking with Governor Wells. He's prepared to grant you a special dispensation recognizing your property rights without the usual oath requirement." Reed blinked in surprise. "That's unexpected." "The governor believes that actions speak louder than oaths. Your defense of Miss Turner and the Johnson family demonstrated a loyalty to principles that transcends mere words on paper." Williams smiled slightly. "Besides, Virginia needs more men like you, Reed, men willing to build bridges rather than burn them." The judge excused himself shortly after leaving Reed and Hannah alone once more. Reed stared at the ceiling, processing the implications of Williams's words. "A special dispensation," he murmured. "Never thought I'd see the day when a Virginia governor would make exceptions for a traitor like me." Hannah moved from her chair to sit on the edge of the bed. "You're not a traitor, Jackson. Not to what truly matters. And what's that? Humanity, justice, the future." Her hand found his warm and steady. "The past is written, But what comes next? That's still being decided by people like you. And Reed looked at their joined hands, then up to Hannah's face, open, honest, unafraid. For the first time since before Appomattox, he felt something like hope stirring within him. Not the desperate hope of a soldier praying to survive the next battle, but something deeper and more sustaining. Hope for a future worth building, worth fighting for. Together, he asked quietly. Hannah's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Together. Outside the window, the evening sky blazed red and gold as the sun set over Richmond. Not the ominous red that sailors warned of, red sky at night sailors' delight, but a vibrant, living crimson that promised fair weather ahead. Reed squeezed Hannah's hand gently, accepting the promise in her touch and in her words. The war had taken his arm, his faith nearly his humanity. But perhaps it had also, in its terrible way, led him here to this moment. This woman, this chance to build something from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The hearing in federal court, the uncertain future of Elkhorn Valley, the long, difficult work of reconstruction, not just of a nation, but of a life. But for now, in the fading light of day, Jackson Reed allowed himself to believe in possibility, in redemption, in a future where the ghosts of the past no longer dictated the choices of the present. Outside, the red sky deepened into dusk. Inside, a man who had been dead since Appomattox discovered with quiet amazement that his heart still knew how to beat with purpose and with hope. A week later, Reed stood before the federal courthouse in Richmond, straightening his borrowed suit jacket as best he could with one hand. His shoulder wound still ached, but the fever had broken, and Dr. Williams, the judge's brother, had pronounced him fit enough to testify. "You look like a man facing a firing squad," Hannah observed as she joined him on the courthouse steps. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair arranged in a practical bun that somehow enhanced rather than diminished her natural beauty. "Courts make me nervous," Reed admitted, "even when I was practicing law." The fearless Lieutenant Reed veteran of Gettysburg and the wilderness afraid of a courtroom. Hannah's teasing tone held no malice, only gentle understanding. "Different kind of battlefield," Reed replied. "Less straightforward." "Well, you won't face it alone." She slipped her arm through his, a gesture of solidarity that drew curious glances from passers-by. A Northern woman and a former Confederate officer publicly aligned. In Richmond, still rebuilding from the war, such a sight remained uncommon. Inside the courtroom buzzed with activity. The case had attracted significant attention, not just because of Hamilton's prominence, but because it represented a test of federal authority in local matters during Reconstruction. Northern newspapers had framed it as a battle against Southern intransigence, Southern papers as federal overreach into state affairs. The reality Reed knew was more complex than either narrative allowed. He spotted Sarah and Solomon seated near the front, both dressed in their Sunday best. Behind them sat Newton Abernathy and his sons, looking uncomfortable in formal attire but determined to show support. Scattered throughout the gallery were faces Reed recognized from Elkhorn Valley townspeople, curious about the outcome, former neighbors watching with varying degrees of sympathy or hostility. And at the defense table sat Curtis Hamilton, flanked by expensive-looking lawyers from Richmond's oldest firms. The banker appeared smaller, somehow diminished without his usual entourage of sycophants. When he caught Reed's eye, his face hardened with cold hatred. Judge Frederick Calloway entered, a tall, austere Northerner appointed by President Grant to oversee Reconstruction cases in Virginia. The courtroom rose, then settled as proceedings began. The federal prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Collins, presented the government's case methodically. Fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder, obstruction of federal programs. The charges mounted, each supported by documentation and witness testimony. Sarah spoke of her family's long-hidden deed. Abernathy described the night he warned Reed of the sheriff's posse. Even Sheridan testified, detailing Hamilton's blackmail and manipulation while accepting his own culpability. When Reed's turn came, he approached the witness stand with military precision despite his injuries. He took the oath and settled into the chair facing the courtroom with the same steady composure that had carried him through artillery barrages and cavalry charges. "Lieutenant Reed," Collins began, "please describe for the court your first encounter with the defendant, Curtis Hamilton." Reed recounted that night at the McGrath property, the hooded men Hannah and Sarah protecting Solomon Hamilton's threats. He continued chronologically through the events that followed, presenting facts without embellishment or emotional coloring. When Hamilton's lawyer rose for cross-examination, his strategy became immediately apparent. "Lieutenant Reed, you served in the Confederate Army, correct?" "I did." "Yet you never took the loyalty oath required of former Confederate officers after the war. Is that correct?" Reed nodded once. "It is. So technically you remain in rebellion against the United States government, a traitor by legal definition." Collins objected immediately. "Your Honor, the witness's past military service is irrelevant to the matters at hand." "On the contrary," Hamilton's lawyer countered smoothly, "it speaks directly to credibility and motive. Lieutenant Reed's resentment toward Reconstruction policies may have colored his perception of my client's legitimate business activities." Judge Calloway considered, then overruled the objection. "The court will hear this line of questioning, but keep it brief, Counselor." Hamilton's lawyer turned back to Reed with the satisfaction of a predator scenting weakness. "Lieutenant, isn't it true that you purchased your property specifically to isolate yourself from federal authority, that you've expressed anti-government sentiments to numerous neighbors?" "No," Reed replied evenly. "I purchased the property because I wanted solitude after the war, not to evade authority." "Yet you refused to participate in local governance, declined to vote in elections, and generally withdrew from civic society. Actions consistent with rejection of federal legitimacy." Reed felt the trap closing. His withdrawal after the war could indeed be interpreted as rejection of the new order, rather than the personal retreat from violence it had actually been. "I withdrew from many things after Appomattox," he said carefully, "politics included. That doesn't make me a traitor." "Perhaps not, but it does raise questions about your motivations in opposing Mr. Hamilton, a prominent citizen working to restore prosperity to the region through legitimate enterprise." The questioning continued in this vein, subtle implications and twisted facts designed to paint Reed as a bitter ex-Confederate, undermining progress, out of resentment. By the time Hamilton's lawyer finished, Reed could see doubt in the faces of some jurors. As he returned to his seat, Hannah squeezed his hand reassuringly. "You did well," she whispered. Reed wasn't so certain. The defense had planted seeds of suspicion that wouldn't easily be uprooted. The fact that he'd never taken the loyalty oath, something he'd avoided out of stubborn pride rather than continued rebellion, now threatened to undermine everything. The proceedings continued through the afternoon, with Hamilton himself finally taking the stand. Under his lawyer's careful guidance, he presented himself as a visionary businessman, obstructed by outdated prejudices and personal vendettas. His attempted shooting of Reed was reframed as self-defense against a dangerous former enemy combatant. It was masterfully done. Reed had to acknowledge that even as his jaw tightened with suppressed anger. When court adjourned for the day, Reed lingered in the gallery, watching Hamilton confer with his lawyers. The banker's confidence seemed to have returned his bearing once again, that of a man accustomed to controlling his environment. "He thinks he's winning," Hannah observed, following Reed's gaze. "He might be," Reed admitted. "His lawyers are good. They've shifted the narrative from fraud and intimidation to progress versus backward-looking resentment. In the current climate, that's a powerful framing. But the documents, the evidence, can be interpreted different ways, especially by a jury with mixed sympathies." Reed rose slowly, his wounded shoulder protesting the long day of inactivity. "Hamilton understands something fundamental about power, Hannah. It's not just about who's right. It's about who controls the story." Outside, the summer evening had turned the sky a brilliant orange gold. They walked slowly toward Judge Williams's home, where both were still staying as guests. The streets of Richmond hummed with the activity of a city rebuilding itself, construction everywhere, new businesses opening alongside the shells of burned-out buildings, the past and future coexisting in uneasy proximity. "What will you do?" Hannah asked after they had walked several blocks, in companionable silence. "If Hamilton is acquitted," Reed considered the question carefully. "I don't know. My land may be legally restored, regardless of the criminal verdict. I could return there. Rebuild. Alone." Hannah's voice held a note of challenge. "I've grown accustomed to solitude," Reed replied, not meeting her eyes. "Have you, or have you simply grown accustomed to hiding from life?" She stopped walking, forcing him to turn and face her. "The man I've come to know these past weeks isn't someone who hides, Jackson. He's someone who stands and fights for what matters." Reed felt something shift inside him, tectonic plates of identity grinding against each other, creating new landscape from old. "And what matters?" he asked quietly. "The future. Not just your own, but ours. All of us." Hannah's eyes held his with unwavering conviction. Elkhorn Valley could be something new, not northern, not southern, but both. A place where what you did in the war matters less than what you do now. Her vision was compelling and terrifying in its implications. For 3 years, Reed had existed in the narrow space between past and present, refusing to imagine a future. Now Hannah was asking him to not only envision one, but help create it. "I don't know if I'm the right man for that kind of building," he said honestly. "I've spent a long time tearing things down, in the war and in myself afterward." Hannah's expression softened. "The best builders are often those who understand destruction most intimately. They know which foundations will hold." Before Reed could respond, a voice called from across the street, "Lieutenant! Reed! Miss Turner!" They turned to see James Sheridan approaching, his military bearing, evident even in civilian clothes. Reed tensed instinctively, the memory of Sheridan's betrayal still raw. "May I speak with you?" Sheridan asked, stopping a respectful distance away. He nodded toward a small tavern on the corner. "Perhaps somewhere private." Reed hesitated, then nodded curtly. Hannah looked uncertain but followed as they entered the establishment, a respectable enough place catering to Richmond's growing commercial class. They found a table in the rear, away from curious ears. "I'll be brief," Sheridan said once they were seated. "Hamilton's lawyers approached me this morning. They want me to change my testimony." Reed's expression remained carefully neutral. "In what way?" "They want me to say I was acting under your instructions all along. That we conspired to undermine Hamilton's legitimate business interests because of shared anti-Reconstruction sympathies." Sheridan's face twisted with disgust. "They're offering to drop all potential charges related to my wartime actions in exchange." "And you're telling us this because," Hannah asked cautiously, "because I'm done being owned." Sheridan met Reed's gaze directly. "What I did to you was unforgivable. I know that. But I won't compound it by lying in court." Reed studied the man before him, a former enemy, then briefly an ally, then a betrayer, and now— what? The complexity of their relationship defied simple categorization, much like the war itself. "What do you want from us?" Reed finally asked. "Nothing." Sheridan shook his head. "I just thought you should know what's coming. They'll try to paint you as the mastermind Reed, a bitter ex-Confederate officer manipulating a Union veteran for revenge against the new order." The strategy was clever. If successful, it would not only undermine the case against Hamilton, but potentially result in charges against Reed himself. "Will you accept their offer?" Hannah asked. Sheridan's jaw tightened. "No, I've lived with blood on my hands for too long already. I won't add more for the sake of a clean slate." He rose to leave, then hesitated. "For what it's worth, Reed, I truly am sorry. Not just for the church, but for letting you believe you were responsible for those civilian deaths at Richmond. We both know the burden of command, how it weighs on a man's soul." Reed nodded once acknowledgement rather than forgiveness. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt, no matter how sincere the contrition. After Sheridan departed, Reed and Hannah sat in thoughtful silence. The tavern had begun to fill with evening customers, merchants, unwinding after-work clerks, celebrating small promotions, the ordinary business of life, continuing, despite the weight of history pressing down on the city. "He could be lying," Hannah finally said, "setting another trap." "He could," Reed agreed. "But I don't think he is." "Why not?" Reed considered the question, trying to articulate what he'd seen in Sheridan's eyes. "Because he's reached the point where truth matters more than consequences. I recognize it because I've been there myself." Hannah absorbed this, her quick mind clearly processing implications. If Hamilton's lawyers are this desperate, they must believe the evidence against him is stronger than they've let on. "Or they simply want to eliminate all risk," Reed countered. "Men like Hamilton don't accept even small chances of defeat." They left the tavern shortly after the evening air, a relief after the stuffy interior. As they resumed their walk toward Judge Williams's home, Reed found himself seeing Richmond with new eyes, not as the fallen capital of a lost cause, but as a city struggling toward a new identity. Neither fully northern nor traditionally southern, but something emerging from the collision of both. Perhaps, he reflected, that was true of himself as well. The second day of trial brought a surprise witness. Judge Harwood Hamilton's co-defendant and former ally had agreed to testify for the prosecution in exchange for leniency. The corpulent judge shuffled to the witness stand, his once imperious bearing deflated by circumstances. Under Collins's questioning, he detailed years of Hamilton's manipulation, fraudulent land claims, corrupted local officials' threats against those who opposed him, all in service of the ambitious railroad and coal venture. "And you participated in this conspiracy willingly?" Collins asked. Harwood's jowls quivered with indignation. "I was misled as to the true nature of the enterprise. Mr. Hamilton represented it as legitimate economic development for the region. Yet you presided over irregular court proceedings, signed backdated documents, and ignored clear evidence of fraud." "Correct." The judge shifted uncomfortably. "I may have exercised poor judgment in certain instances." Hamilton watched his former friend's testimony with cold fury, occasionally whispering urgently to his lawyers. Reed observed the dynamic with grim satisfaction. The alliance of convenience was crumbling as self-preservation took precedence over loyalty. When Harwood described the planned show trial of Reed, the special session that was to provide legal cover for Reed's execution, murmurs of shock rippled through the courtroom. And this was Mr. Hamilton's explicit plan to have Lieutenant Reed executed under color of law, Collins pressed. He made his intentions quite clear. Harwood confirmed, avoiding Hamilton's glare. Said a public hanging would discourage further interference with his business interests. The testimony continued through the morning, each revelation more damning than the last. By lunch recess, the momentum had clearly shifted in the prosecution's favor. Harwood's turned completely, Hannah observed, as they took refreshment at a nearby cafe. Hamilton must be furious. Reed nodded, watching the courthouse through the cafe window. Desperate men are dangerous, Hannah. Hamilton won't accept defeat easily. What can he do now? The evidence seems overwhelming. There are always options for men with money and connections. Reed's expression darkened. Jurors can be threatened or bribed. Witnesses can disappear. Evidence can be destroyed. Hannah studied him with concern. You're worried. Cautious, Reed corrected. The game isn't over until judgment is rendered. His caution proved warranted. When court reconvened, Hamilton's lead attorney announced that new evidence had come to light, evidence that would completely recontextualize the events in question. Judge Calloway frowned. New evidence should have been disclosed during discovery, Counselor. This only came into our possession this morning, Your Honor, the lawyer replied smoothly. A letter from Lieutenant Reed to Governor Letcher, dated March 1865, expressing continued commitment to the Confederate cause and detailing plans to resist federal authority after the anticipated defeat. Reed stiffened in shock. That's a forgery. I never wrote such a letter. Collins was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This alleged evidence was not properly disclosed, and its authenticity is highly questionable. We have an expert witness prepared to verify the handwriting, Hamilton's lawyer countered, and the letter's provenance is documented. It was discovered in state archives during routine cataloging. Judge Calloway's expression was severe. I'll review this alleged letter in chambers before deciding on its admissibility. Court is recessed for 1 hour. As the gallery buzzed with speculation, Reed turned to Hannah. It's a forgery, he repeated urgently. I never corresponded with Governor Letcher, never wrote any such plans. I believe you, Hannah assured him. But can you prove it? The question hung between them unanswerable. Against expert testimony and official archives, Reed's denial might carry little weight. When court resumed, Judge Calloway's face was grave. After reviewing the document in question, I find its authenticity sufficiently established for admission. However, Lieutenant Reed will be permitted to challenge this evidence during cross-examination of the authentication witness. Hamilton's triumphant smile told Reed everything he needed to know. The letter was convincing enough to potentially destroy his credibility, and with it, the entire case. The expert, presented by Hamilton's team, was a professor from the University of Virginia, a dignified gentleman who testified with academic precision about the characteristics of Reed's handwriting, citing samples from military reports for comparison. When Reed's turn for cross-examination came, he approached the witness stand with cold fury contained beneath military discipline. Professor Whitman, you've compared this alleged letter to reports I filed during the war. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct, the professor affirmed. The handwriting patterns are consistent across all documents. Reed nodded thoughtfully. And did you analyze the paper and ink as well? To some degree, yes. Both appear consistent with materials available in Virginia during the time period in question. Reed leaned forward slightly. Are you aware, Professor, that I lost my right arm at Gettysburg in July 1863? The professor blinked in confusion. I don't see the relevance. I'm naturally right-handed, Reed continued evenly. After Gettysburg, I had to learn to write with my left hand. All reports filed after July 1863 show the distinctive characteristics of that left-handed writing. Inconsistent pressure, slight rightward slant, occasional shaking. Understanding dawned on the professor's face. Yet this letter, allegedly written in March 1865, shows none of those characteristics. It displays the confident, smooth handwriting of my pre-injury right hand. Reed's voice hardened. A physical impossibility unless I somehow regrew my arm for the specific purpose of writing treasonous correspondence. A ripple of reaction swept the courtroom. The professor's face had gone pale. I was not informed of your injury, he stammered. The comparison samples I was provided were all from before Gettysburg. Reed finished for him, selectively chosen to match the forgery. He turned to Judge Calloway. Your Honor, I request that the court compare this alleged letter with my actual post-injury writing. Judge Williams has several recent letters I've written during my convalescence at his home. The judge nodded grimly. The court will order such comparison. In the meantime, this evidence is considered challenged and will be given appropriate weight. His gaze hardened as it fell on Hamilton's lawyers. And the court will investigate the selective presentation of comparison samples which appears deliberately misleading. As Reed returned to his seat, he noted the thunderous expression on Hamilton's face. The banker leaned close to his attorney, whispering urgently. Whatever contingency plan they had prepared was now in motion. The afternoon proceeded with testimony from additional witnesses, townspeople from Elkhorn Valley, describing Hamilton's intimidation tactics, land office clerks confirming the authenticity of Sarah's family documents, federal agents detailing the broader pattern of fraud across the region. By day's end, despite the attempted forgery, the case against Hamilton appeared stronger than ever. As court adjourned, Reed felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since the trial began. That optimism shattered when a breathless messenger found them outside the courthouse. Lieutenant Reed, Miss Turner. The boy skidded to a halt before them. Judge Williams sent me. There's been a fire at his home. All your documents, they're gone. Reed and Hannah exchanged alarmed glances before hurrying through Richmond's streets toward the judge's residence. From blocks away, they could see smoke rising above the rooftops. As they approached, the destruction became clear. The judge's study, where the land deeds and Sarah's family papers had been kept, had been gutted by fire. Judge Williams himself stood in the street, directing the volunteer fire brigade as they doused the remaining hot spots. Williams, Reed called as they approached. What happened? The judge turned his face grim beneath soot stains. Someone broke in while we were at court. Started the fire deliberately in the study, where all the case documents were kept. Everything's gone, Hannah asked, horror evident in her voice. Every original document, Williams confirmed. The fire was contained to that room, almost surgical in its precision. Reed's jaw tightened as he surveyed the damage. Hamilton, most likely, Williams agreed, though proving it will be difficult. The house was empty except for the servants who were in the kitchen wing. Hannah moved closer to the burned section, peering through a shattered window at the charred remains of what had been a meticulous legal archive. Without those documents, she began. We still have testimony, Reed reminded her, and copies were filed with the federal court when the case began. Copies aren't always given the same weight as originals, Williams cautioned, especially in land disputes. Hamilton's lawyers will argue that the copies may have been altered. Reed paced the street, his military mind assessing the situation with cold precision. This is desperate. Hamilton's showing his hand. What do you mean? Hannah asked. He wouldn't risk arson, a capital offense. unless he believed he was already losing. This is a last resort, not a calculated strategy. Williams nodded slowly. I agree, which means he may attempt other desperate measures before tomorrow's final arguments. We should warn Collins, Hannah suggested, and the judge, and stay vigilant ourselves, Reed added grimly. Hamilton's proven he's willing to eliminate witnesses when necessary. As if to emphasize his point, gunfire suddenly erupted from the street corner. Reed reacted instinctively, pulling Hannah to the ground behind the shelter of a nearby wagon. Judge Williams ducked behind a water barrel as bullets splintered wood around them. Are you hit? Reed demanded, scanning Hannah for injuries. No, I'm fine, she gasped, eyes wide with shock. Who's shooting? Reed risked a glance around the wagon's edge. Two men with revolvers were advancing methodically up the street, using doorways for cover. Their faces were hidden by bandanas, but their purpose was clear from the way they targeted the area where Reed and Hannah had taken shelter. Hamilton's men, Reed concluded grimly. Professional work, not random violence. More shots rang out. The fire brigade and onlookers had scattered, leaving the street eerily empty, except for the attackers and their targets. We're pinned down, Reed assessed, calculating angles and distances. And unarmed. Hannah's expression shifted from fear to determination. Not entirely unarmed. She reached beneath her skirt and withdrew a small Derringer pistol. Reed's eyebrows rose in surprise. Sarah insisted I carry it. Hannah explained, a hint of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. After everything that happened at the settlement. Remind me to thank her, Reed said, taking the tiny weapon. It held only 2 shots, barely a defensive tool against determined attackers with revolvers. But it was better than nothing. We need to reach the back of the house, Judge Williams called from his position. My study may be burned, but my gun cabinet isn't. Reed nodded his understanding. The judge's home sat in the middle of the block with an alley running behind it that could provide escape if they could reach it. When I fire, run for the side passage, Reed instructed Hannah. Don't stop, don't look back. I'll be right behind you. Hannah's eyes met his fear, and trust mingled equally. Both of us or neither, Jackson. I won't leave you. There was no time to argue. The gunmen were advancing, tightening the noose. Reed took a deep breath, steadying his hand as he had done countless times on battlefields across Virginia. He fired the first shot deliberately wide to draw attention. As expected, both attackers swiveled toward the sound, returning fire, with barked commands to each other that confirmed Reed's suspicion of military training. Now, Reed urged, and they broke from cover, sprinting toward the narrow passage between Williams's home and the neighboring building. Bullets kicked up dust at their heels as they ran. Reed kept his body between Hannah and the attackers as much as possible. The instinct to protect overriding tactical considerations. They reached the passage just as Reed's leg erupted in searing pain. He stumbled, nearly falling, but Hannah's arm around his waist kept him upright as they plunged into the relative safety of the narrow corridor. You're hit, she gasped, noting the blood spreading across his trouser leg. Flesh wound, Reed assessed through gritted teeth. Keep moving. They half ran, half stumbled through the passage toward the rear of the property, where Judge Williams was already unlocking a small door into the house's kitchen wing. Inside quickly, Williams urged, ushering them through before following and securing the door with a heavy wooden bar. The kitchen was mercifully empty, the servants having fled during the initial gunfire. Williams moved to a cabinet, retrieving a shotgun and loading it with practiced efficiency that spoke of his own military past. Upstairs, my bedroom, he directed. Second floor gives us the advantage if they break in. There's a rifle in the wardrobe. Reed nodded combat calculus automatically, assessing defensive positions and fields of fire. Despite the pain in his leg, he helped Hannah up the narrow servants' stairs, emerging into the upper hallway of the judge's substantial home. Williams's bedroom offered a commanding view of both the street and the rear alley. Reed positioned himself at the window overlooking the front, while Williams took the rear. Hannah tore strips from a bedsheet to bind Reed's leg, wound her hands steady despite the danger. "They're circling," Williams reported from his position. "One in front, one behind, methodical." Reed checked the rifle's loading. Professional manhunters, not common thugs. Hamilton's sparing no expense. "Why now?" Hannah asked as she finished bandaging Reed's leg. "Why not wait for the trial's outcome?" "Because Hamilton knows he's losing," Reed replied grimly. "Without us to testify tomorrow, without the original documents, his chances improve dramatically." Williams cocked his shotgun as movement caught his eye. "Back door! They're attempting to force it." Reed calculated quickly. "They'll create a diversion at one entrance, then hit us from the other. Standard military tactic." "I'll alert the neighbors," Hannah suggested, moving toward the door. Reed caught her arm. "Too dangerous. They've likely covered all exits. Our best chance is to hold position and hope the gunfire has attracted police attention." As if on cue, the sound of breaking glass echoed from below, followed by heavy footsteps entering the house. "Front parlor window," Williams confirmed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They're inside." Reed positioned himself behind the bedroom door, rifle ready. Hannah moved to the wardrobe, finding another weapon, a heavy fire iron, and gripping it with determined hands. The house fell silent, except for the creaking of floorboards as the intruders moved methodically through the lower level. Reed knew they were searching room by room, ensuring no surprises before ascending to the second floor. Minutes stretched like hours. Reed's wounded leg throbbed with increasing intensity, but he forced the pain aside, focusing on the approaching threat. His mind cleared with the familiar cold precision of combat angles timing targets. The chaos of emotion receded, replaced by tactical clarity. When the first attacker appeared at the top of the stairs, Reed was ready. The rifle cracked the shot, carefully placed to wound rather than kill. The man fell backward with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder. Immediately, return fire erupted from below, bullets splintering the banister and thudding into walls. Williams responded with his shotgun, the weapon's roar deafening in the confined space. "Police!" a voice suddenly shouted from outside. "Richmond police! Throw down your weapons!" The gunfire paused momentarily, then resumed with increased desperation. The second attacker charged up the stairs, firing wildly. Reed's second shot caught him in the leg, sending him sprawling onto the landing. More voices joined the first, along with the sound of multiple boots entering the house from both front and rear. "Drop your weapons! You're surrounded." For a tense moment, Reed thought the attackers might fight to the end. Then the wounded man on the landing carefully placed his revolver on the floor, raising his hands in surrender. "Don't shoot," he called weakly. "We're unarmed." Police officers swarmed the staircase, securing the attackers and checking the rest of the house. Reed lowered his rifle, the combat clarity fading as pain returned in a rushing wave. Hannah was immediately at his side, supporting him as his wounded leg threatened to buckle. "It's over," she said softly. "We're safe." Reed nodded, too exhausted for words. The day's events, the trial, the fire, the gunfight had drained his limited reserves of strength. As police officers entered the bedroom, he surrendered to the darkness that had been hovering at the edges of his vision, collapsing into Hannah's arms. His last conscious thought was of her face above his determination and fear, and something deeper etched into every feature as she called his name into the gathering darkness. Reed dreamed of Appomattox, not the surrender itself, which he had witnessed from a field hospital bed, his remaining arm bandaged, where a Union Minié ball had shattered bone, but the aftermath. The long journey home through a defeated landscape. The slow, painful realization that surviving the war might be more difficult than fighting it. He had been among the fortunate ones, an officer with education and skills beyond soldiering property that hadn't been destroyed, family connections that smoothed his return to civilian life. Yet he had chosen isolation, retreating to the Blue Ridge foothills to nurse wounds both physical and spiritual. In his dream he walked those hills again, but not alone. Hannah moved beside him, pointing out beauty he had been blind to: wildflowers pushing through rocky soil, deer paths winding through ancient forests, sunlight dappling mountain streams. Sarah and Solomon followed, their voices raised in a song about freedom and hope. The dream shifted. Hamilton appeared not as the prosperous banker, but as a Union officer, ordering an attack on civilians. Reed tried to intervene, but his feet were rooted to the ground, his voice silenced. He could only watch as flames consumed a settlement much like the one near his cabin. Then Sheridan was beside him in Confederate gray rather than Union blue, offering a hand in alliance. "Soldier's code," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "Some things transcend the colors we wear." Reed woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings. White walls, clean sheets, the antiseptic smell of a hospital. His leg throbbed dully, professionally bandaged and elevated on pillows. "Welcome back," a familiar voice said. Hannah sat in a chair beside the bed, dark circles beneath her eyes, suggesting she had maintained another vigil during his unconsciousness. "How long?" Reed asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Just overnight," she assured him. "The doctor says you were lucky the bullet passed clean through without hitting bone or major vessels." Reed nodded, processing this information along with fragments of his dream. The trial, postponed one day due to the unfortunate incident, as Judge Calloway called it. Hannah's lips curved in a slight smile. "He was less diplomatic in private, I'm told. Attempted murder of witnesses won't improve Hamilton's position. The attackers, former Confederate irregulars turned hired guns after the war. They're being questioned, but so far have refused to implicate Hamilton directly." Hannah leaned forward, her expression serious. "One of them, though, was carrying a letter of introduction signed by Sheriff Wilson. The connection to Hamilton is circumstantial, but compelling." Reed absorbed this tactical mind, automatically calculating implications for the trial. "Have there been threats against Sarah and Solomon?" "They've been moved to the federal garrison for protection," Hannah assured him. "Judge Williams as well, though he complained bitterly about being coddled like a schoolgirl." That brought a brief smile to Reed's face, imagining the dignified judge's indignation. The smile faded as he shifted position, pain lancing through his wounded leg. "The doctor says you'll walk with a limp at least for a while," Hannah said, noting his grimace. "But there should be no permanent disability." "Another scar to add to the collection," Reed remarked dryly. "At this rate, I'll soon have more marks than unmarked skin." Hannah's expression softened. "Each one tells a story of survival, Jackson, of choosing life when death would have been easier." The simple statement pierced something in Reed's chest, a truth he had been avoiding since Appomattox. He had survived, yes, but without truly living. Existing in the narrow space between past and future, unwilling to fully inhabit either. "When is the trial scheduled to resume?" he asked, changing the subject from dangerous emotional terrain. "Tomorrow morning. Judge Calloway was quite insistent that acts of violence will not disrupt the course of justice. Hannah studied him with concern. "The doctor says you shouldn't be moved, but—" "I'll be there," Reed interrupted firmly, "even if I have to crawl into that courtroom." Hannah's expression suggested she might argue, but something in his face must have convinced her of his resolve. "At least use a cane," she compromised. "I won't have you reopening that wound through stubborn pride." Reed nodded his agreement, then turned his gaze to the window where Richmond's skyline was visible against a clear blue sky. Rebuilding continued everywhere, new structures rising alongside patched remnants of the old. "What happens after?" he asked quietly. "When this is over, one way or another?" Hannah was silent for a long moment, perhaps surprised by the question from a man who had seemed to live entirely in the present since she'd known him. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "The Bureau has offered me a new position supervising educational initiatives across 3 counties. Sarah wants to reclaim her family land, build a proper home for Solomon. And you—" She left the statement unfinished, a question hanging in the air between them. "And me," Reed echoed thoughtfully. 3 years ago, I chose isolation because I couldn't see any other path forward. Couldn't imagine belonging anywhere after what I'd seen, what I'd done. And now," Reed met her gaze directly, "now I'm not so certain. Perhaps there are ways to build something worthwhile from the ruins, not despite the past, but because of it." Hannah's eyes brightened with something that might have been hope. "There's room in this new world for men who understand both destruction and creation, Jackson. Men who've seen the worst of humanity but still believe in its potential for better." The conversation might have continued in this vein, exploring possibilities neither had dared voice explicitly, but they were interrupted by a knock at the hospital room door. Federal Prosecutor Collins entered, his expression a mixture of concern and urgency. "Lieutenant Reed, Miss Turner. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Reed assured him, straightening against his pillows with instinctive military formality. "What news?" "Significant developments," Collins replied, taking the chair Hannah offered. "First, one of your attackers has agreed to testify that he was hired directly by Hamilton's estate manager, with the understanding that the orders originated from Hamilton himself." "That's unexpected," Reed observed. "These types rarely turn on their employers." "The prospect of hanging concentrates the mind wonderfully," Collins noted dryly, "particularly when one is already wanted for 3 previous murders in Tennessee." Hannah leaned forward eagerly. "Does this strengthen the case?" "Substantially. Attempted murder of witnesses is difficult to explain away as legitimate business practice." Collins opened his briefcase, withdrawing several documents. "But there's more. After the attack, Judge Calloway ordered an immediate search of Hamilton's Richmond residence and business offices." He handed a document to Reed. "We found this in his private safe. I thought you might find it illuminating." Reed scanned the paper, his expression hardening as he read. It was a contract between Hamilton and several northern investors detailing plans for the Elkhorn Valley coal operation. The document specifically mentioned removal of existing settlement populations and acquisition of key properties through legal mechanisms. "Legal mechanisms," Reed repeated bitterly, "a sanitized term for fraud and intimidation." "Read the final page," Collins urged. Reed turned to the last sheet where signatures formalized the agreement. Among them was a name that caused his breath to catch: General William Hayward, former Union commander and current head of the Reconstruction Commission for Virginia. "Hayward was involved?" Hannah asked, reading over Reed's shoulder. "But he's been one of the strongest advocates for freedmen's rights in the state." "Publicly, yes," Collins confirmed grimly. "Privately, it seems he's been investing in ventures that directly undermine those rights. The hypocrisy is remarkable." Reed handed the document back, his tactical mind already calculating the broader implications. This goes beyond Hamilton, beyond Elkhorn Valley. Indeed, Collins agreed. We've uncovered similar arrangements in 3 other counties, a pattern of corruption that threatens the entire Reconstruction effort in Virginia. Hannah's face reflected dawning horror. If this becomes public, it will fuel every criticism of Northern carpetbaggers exploiting the South, Reed finished for her. Set back reconciliation by years. Collins nodded soberly. Which presents us with a dilemma. Pursue the full extent of the conspiracy with all the political consequences that entails, or focus narrowly on Hamilton and his immediate accomplices preserving the broader Reconstruction agenda. The room fell silent as the 3 considered the impossible choice before them. Justice versus practicality. Truth versus stability. Individual accountability versus collective progress. "What does Judge Calloway think?" Reed finally asked. "He's consulting with officials in Washington," Collins replied. "The decision may ultimately come from President Grant himself." Another silence fell heavier than before. Reed stared out the window at the rebuilding city, thinking of all that had been sacrificed to reach even this tenuous peace. The corruption Collins had uncovered could shatter that peace, triggering new cycles of resentment and retaliation. Yet covering it up betrayed the very principles for which so many had died, including Reed's own men at Gettysburg and Antietam, the Wilderness. "There must be a third path," Hannah said suddenly, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "One that honors truth while preserving progress." "What did you have in mind?" Collins asked, looking intrigued despite his obvious skepticism. "Isolate the cancer without killing the patient," she suggested. "Prosecute Hamilton and his direct conspirators fully. Make public examples of them. But handle the broader corruption internally through reforms rather than prosecutions. Replace compromised officials quietly without public scandal." Reed nodded slowly, seeing the wisdom in her approach. Selective accountability. Enough to establish consequences, but not enough to destroy the system itself. Collins considered this, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against his briefcase. "It might work. Calloway has the discretion to seal certain evidence while admitting other portions." "The key is Hamilton," Reed added. "He must be held fully accountable publicly and irrevocably. A clear message that such behavior won't be tolerated regardless of wealth or connections." "I believe Judge Calloway will agree," Collins said, rising to leave. "The trial resumes tomorrow at 9. Can you be there? Lieutenant, your testimony remains crucial." Reed nodded firmly. "I'll be there. Some things matter more than personal comfort." After Collins departed, Reed and Hannah sat in contemplative silence, the weight of what they had learned settling between them like a physical presence. "It's never simple, is it?" Hannah finally said. "Justice, reconstruction, building something new from the ashes of the old." "No," Reed agreed quietly. "The war was simpler in some ways. Clear enemies defined objectives. This," he gestured toward the window toward Richmond and all it represented, "this requires a different kind of courage. The courage to compromise without surrendering principle." Hannah moved to sit on the edge of his bed, her hand finding his in a gesture that had become natural between them. "You have that courage, Jackson. You always have." Her eyes held his with absolute conviction. "It's why you saved Sarah and Solomon that night. Why you stood against Hamilton when easier paths were available. Why you're here now, preparing to testify despite your wounds." Reed looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and weathered, hers smaller but equally strong in their own way. Different kinds of strength, complementary rather than opposed. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said slowly, Whatever path forward emerges from this trial, I don't want to walk it alone anymore. The simple statement contained multitudes' acknowledgement of his self-imposed isolation, recognition of what Hannah had come to mean to him, tentative vision of a shared future. Hannah's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. You won't have to, Jackson. Not anymore. Outside the hospital window, Richmond continued its slow transformation, past and future, coexisting in every rebuilt street and new foundation. Within the room, a similar transformation was occurring between two people who had found each other across divides of North and South peace, and war isolation and connection. The trial awaited them tomorrow, with all its uncertainties and consequences. But for this moment, in this room, Jackson Reed allowed himself to believe in possibilities he had long since abandoned. In healing that went beyond physical wounds. In a future worth building together. End of Part 4 continues to Part 5.